In the shadowed halls of Worthington Manor, a diplomat lies dead, shot in a locked study with no way in or out. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle smile hides a razor-sharp mind. For suspects weave a web of secrets, a poised widow with cryptic letters, a restless heir with midnight dealings, a timid governess hiding shame, and a silent maid with ties to Berlin's spies. As whispers of a 1905 scandal unravel, Marple must untangle lies, blackmail, and betrayal before the killer strikes. Again, who holds the key to the locked room? Man the truth. Chapter 1. The Shadow of Death. The village of St. Mary Mead lay bathed in the golden haze of a June afternoon, its thatched cottages and winding lanes exuding a tranquility that belied the storm about to break. Roses climbed the walls of the vicarage, their scent mingling with the distant hum of bees, and the church clock chimed lazily, as if time itself were reluctant to disturb the peace. Yet, at Worthington Manor, a Georgian pile of weathered stone perched on the village's edge. A tragedy had unfolded that set tongues wagging from the post office to the Blue Boar Inn. Sir Henry Worthington, a retired diplomat whose name carried weight in Whitehall's hushed corridors, had been found dead in his study, a bullet through his heart, the door locked from within, and the only key glinting on the desk beside his lifeless form bought Miss Jane Marple, whose unassuming presence and penchant for knitting concealed a mind sharper than a razor, sat in her neat parlour at Danemead Cottage, her fingers deftly working a skein of pale blue wool. The news had reached her via Mrs. Bantry, whose husband, Colonel Bantry, had been summoned to the manor as a friend of the family. A locked room, Jane, Mrs. Bantry had said, her eyes wide over a cup of Darjeeling. No one, in or out, they say the police are baffled, but I told Arthur you'd have a notion or two. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. People do talk, she murmured, her needles clicking rhythmically, and a locked room is rarely as impenetrable as it appears. By evening, an invitation arrived from Lady Eleanor Worthington, Sir Henry's widow, requesting Miss Marple's presence at the manor to offer comfort in this dreadful time. The request was polite but perfunctory, and Miss Marple, who knew the ways of great houses, suspected it came at Colonel Bantry's urging. She packed a small valise, her eyes lingering on the garden where her nephew Raymond's roses bloomed with reckless abandon. A diplomat's death, she thought, is seldom a simple affair. With her shawl draped over her shoulders and her hat pinned firmly in place, she set out for Worthington Manor, her mind already turning over the fragments of gossip sheet gleaned. The manor's oak-panelled hall was cool and dim, its air heavy with the scent of beeswax and old money. Lady Eleanor greeted Miss Marple with a composure that bordered on froideur, her tall frame swathed in black crape, her pale hands clasped tightly before her. "You are kind to come, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and measured. "This is a terrible shock." Her grey eyes, however, held no trace of tears, and Miss Marple noted the faint lines of strain around her mouth. Over tea in the drawing room, served by a silent footman, Lady Eleanor spoke briefly of her husband's career decades spent navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. With postings in Berlin, Vienna, and Rome, he had enemies, of course, she added, almost as an afterthought, her fingers brushing a diamond brooch pinned to her bodice. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the jewel, its sparkle at odds with the widow's mourning. Enemies, she thought, or secrets. The household, Lady Eleanor explained, was small but complex. There was Captain Reginald Blake, Sir Henry's nephew, a former army officer whose charm masked a restless ambition. "He's been staying with us since his return from India," Lady Eleanor said, a note of weariness in her voice. "Henry hoped to guide him." Then there was Miss Clara Henshaw, the governess, who had remained after the death of Sir Henry's ward, her role now vague but her presence enduring. "A most dependable woman," Lady Eleanor remarked, though her tone lacked warmth. Finally, there was Gretchen Muller, the German maid, hired 6 months ago on a recommendation from a distant acquaintance. "She's efficient," Lady Eleanor said curtly, if somewhat reserved. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mild blue eyes taking in the room's heavy drapes and gilt-framed portraits. The manor felt like a stage, its players carefully positioned, each with a role to play or to conceal. As Lady Eleanor excused herself to attend to correspondence, Miss Marple wandered to the window, her gaze falling on the manicured lawn where Captain Blake stood smoking a cigarette, his posture tense. Beyond him, near the rose garden, Miss Henshaw walked with measured steps, her grey dress blending with the dusk, and in the distance Gretchen Muller moved swiftly toward the servants' entrance, her head bowed as if to avoid notice. That night, in the guest room with its chintzed curtains and creaking floorboards, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting abandoned on her lap. The village had already begun to weave its theories: burglars, suicide, even a vengeful foreign agent, but Miss Marple dismissed such flights of fancy. "Motive," she murmured, "lies closer to home." She thought of Lady Eleanor's brooch, Captain Blake's cigarette glowing in the dark, Miss Henshaw's solitary walk, and Gretchen's hurried steps. 4 suspects, each with a thread to unravel. "A locked room," she said softly, "is only the beginning." Chapter 2. The Widow's Vow. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Worthington Manor, casting long, dappled shadows across the polished parquet of the morning room. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender polish and the faint, lingering trace of Sir Henry Worthington's Havana cigars, a reminder of the man whose absence now dominated the house. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a her-backed chair with her knitting bag at her side, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of mild curiosity and piercing insight. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively gentle behind their spectacles, missed nothing, not the faint tremor in the butler's hand as he poured tea, nor the way the sunlight glinted off Lady Eleanor Worthington's diamond brooch, pinned prominently to her morning gown. The brooch, Miss Marple noted, was an exquisite piece, its facets catching the light with a fire that seemed almost defiant in the sombre atmosphere. Lady Eleanor herself sat opposite, her posture as rigid as the mahogany table between them. She was a striking woman, tall and statuesque, with ash-blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, and features that might have been called beautiful were they not so tightly controlled. Her black dress, tailored to perfection, was a study in understated wealth, but it was the brooch that drew Miss Marple's attention, a cluster of diamonds set in platinum, shaped like a starburst, and far too opulent for a widow's first days of grief. A gift, perhaps, Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking softly as she worked a row of pearl stitches, but from whom and when? The question lingered in her mind like a half-remembered tune, one she would pursue with the patience of a gardener tending a delicate bloom. "Thank you for staying." "Miss Marple," Lady Eleanor said, her voice low and carefully modulated, as if each word had been weighed before being spoken. "The house feels unmoored without Henry. Your presence is a comfort." The words were polite, but there was a brittleness to them, a hint of strain that Miss Marple recognized from countless encounters with those who had something to hide. She smiled, her expression one of gentle sympathy, and murmured, "It's the least I can do, my dear. A loss like this leaves such a void." The tea was excellent Darjeeling, served in bone china cups with a delicate rose pattern, and Miss Marple sipped it slowly, allowing the conversation to unfold at its own pace. Lady Eleanor spoke of practical matters, the arrangements for Sir Henry's memorial, the letters of condolence that had begun to arrive from London and beyond, the necessity of meeting with the solicitor to discuss the estate. Her tone was brisk, almost businesslike, and Miss Marple noted the absence of any mention of personal grief. She speaks of him as one might speak of a colleague, Miss Marple thought, not a husband of 20 years. It was not an uncommon trait among the upper classes, where emotion was often cloaked in decorum, but it piqued her curiosity nonetheless. As the butler, a stooped man named Hargreaves, cleared the tea tray, Miss Marple ventured a gentle probe. "Sir Henry's career must have been quite demanding," she said, her tone conversational. "All those years abroad, Berlin, Vienna, Rome, it can't have been easy for you, moving from one city to another." Lady Eleanor's hand paused briefly as she reached for her cup. A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, or caution crossing her face before it smoothed into neutrality. "It was a different life," she replied, setting the cup down with a faint clink. "Henry thrived on it, of course. He had a knack for diplomacy, for navigating difficult situations, but it was isolating at times." She hesitated, then added, "He was preoccupied in recent months, though he never shared." "Why?" "Some old matter from his Foreign Office days, I suppose." The words were casual, but Miss Marple's ears caught the slight emphasis on preoccupied, as if it were a door left ajar, inviting further inquiry. "Old matters have a way of resurfacing," Miss Marple said mildly, her needles pausing as she met Lady Eleanor's gaze. "Perhaps something from his time abroad. He must have made many connections, some less savoury than others." It was a delicate thrust, but Lady Eleanor parried it with ease. "Henry was discreet," she said, her lips curving into a faint, humourless smile. "He never brought his work home. If there were connections, as you say, they remained in Whitehall or wherever such things are kept." She rose, smoothing her dress with a practised gesture. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have letters to attend to. Do make yourself at home." With a nod, she glided from the room, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume jasmine. Miss Marple noted, with a hint of something sharper, like citrus. Alone, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, and rose to examine the room. The morning room was a study in restrained elegance, walls panelled in pale oak, a marble fireplace adorned with a single vase of white lilies, and a series of watercolours depicting Italian landscapes, no doubt acquired during Sir Henry's posting. In Rome, a writing desk stood in one corner, its surface immaculate save for a silver inkstand and a small stack of envelopes. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the envelopes, their edges crisp and their postmarks recent. One, she noted, bore a London postmark and a crest she did not recognize, a lion rampant, embossed in gold. "Letters," she murmured, "are such talkative things." Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hall, heavy and purposeful. Captain Reginald Blake appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He was a handsome man, with the tanned complexion of one who had spent years under foreign suns. But his dark eyes held a restlessness that Miss Marple found faintly unsettling. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm but tinged with impatience, "I didn't expect to find you here. Aunt Eleanor said You'd be poking about. Poking about. Miss Marple echoed, her smile disarming. Oh, I'm far too old for that, Captain Blake. I'm merely keeping Lady Eleanor company in this sad time. She gestured to her knitting, as if it were evidence of her harmlessness, but her eyes noted the faint stain of tobacco on his fingers and the slight bulge in his jacket pocket, suggestive of a flask or perhaps something heavier. Reginald laughed, a short barking sound. You've a reputation, you know. The village says you see through people like glass. Uncle Henry would have liked you. He admired a sharp mind. He crossed to the window, his movements restless, and lit a cigarette, exhaling a plume of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. This business with him, it's a damned mess. Locked room, they say, makes no sense. Very little does, at first, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. But things have a way of clarifying, given time. You were close to your uncle. I understand. It was a gentle question, but she watched his reaction closely, noting the way his jaw tightened before he answered. Close enough, he said, flicking ash into a crystal tray. He was a hard man to know, always playing his cards close. Thought I was a fool for wanting to strike out on my own said. I'd ruined the family name. There was bitterness in his voice, and Miss Marple filed it away, along with the memory of the gardener's tale about Reginald's midnight wanderings near the manor's old well. A soldier's grudge, she thought, or something deeper. Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of Miss Clara Henshaw, the governess, who entered with a tray of fresh scones and a pot of clotted cream. She was a small, wiry woman in her late 30s, her brown hair pulled tightly into a bun and her grey dress as severe as a nun's habit. Her eyes, however, were sharp and alert, darting from Reginald to Miss Marple with a wariness that bordered on suspicion. Lady Eleanor thought you might like some refreshment, she said, her voice clipped. I'll leave you to it. Thank you, Miss Henshaw, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. How kind of you to bring it yourself. You must be invaluable to the household. The compliment was sincere, but it was also a probe, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush that rose to Clara's cheeks. It's my duty, Clara said, her hands smoothing her apron with a nervous gesture. I've been here 10 years, long enough to know my place. She turned to leave, but not before Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance she cast toward the writing desk, as if checking that its contents remained undisturbed. 10 years, Miss Marple thought, is long enough to learn a great many secrets. As Clara departed, Reginald stubbed out his cigarette and excused himself, muttering something about estate business. Miss Marple was alone once more, but not for long. Gretchen, Muller, the German maid, entered to clear the scone tray, her movements swift and silent. She was a young woman, perhaps 25, with fair hair braided neatly and a face that was pleasant but unremarkable, save for the intensity of her green eyes. Is there anything else you need, ma'am? She asked, her English flawless, but with a faint trace of an accent Berlin, Miss Marple thought, or perhaps Hamburg. No, thank you, Gretchen, Miss Marple said, her tone kindly. You've been with the family a short time, I hear. It must be quite an adjustment, coming to a place like this. She watched the maid closely, noting the slight stiffening of her posture, the way her hands paused briefly on the tray. 6 months, ma'am, Gretchen said, her voice neutral. It's a good position. I'm grateful for it. She offered a polite smile and left, her footsteps barely audible on the parquet. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Grateful, she murmured, but not at ease. The rest of the morning passed quietly. But Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She took a turn about the manor's gardens, her shawl draped over her shoulders, ostensibly to admire the roses, but in truth to observe the household from a distance. Lady Eleanor was visible through the library window, seated at a desk with a pile of letters before her, her pen moving swiftly across the page. Captain Blake was nowhere to be seen, but Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Clara Henshaw near the greenhouse, her head bent in conversation with the Governnesss. That ended abruptly when Clara noticed Miss Marple's approach. Gretchen, meanwhile, was seen carrying a basket of linens to the laundry, her pace brisk and her expression unreadable at luncheon, served in the dining room with its heavy damask curtains and portraits of Worthington ancestors. Miss Marple had the opportunity to observe the household together. Lady Eleanor presided with cool authority, her conversation limited to the weather and the quality of the soup. Reginald was restless, his fingers drumming on the table, while Clara ate in silence, her eyes fixed on her plate. Gretchen served, her presence almost invisible, yet Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on Lady Eleanor's brooch, as if calculating its worth or its significance. After luncheon, Miss Marple retired to the morning room once more, her knitting resumed by her thoughts elsewhere. The village postmistress, a reliable source of gossip, had mentioned a series of letters arriving for Lady Eleanor in recent weeks, each postmarked from London and written in a bold, masculine hand. The crest on the envelope Miss Marple had seen earlier suggested a connection to someone of importance, perhaps a peer or a figure from Sir Henry's diplomatic past. Letters, Miss Marple thought, are like footprints. They lead somewhere, if one knows how to follow. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Inspector Katic, a young but capable officer from the county police, entered, his notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, with a respectful nod, "I was hoping to have a word. Colonel Bantry says you've a knack for these things." His tone was earnest, but there was a hint of skepticism in his eyes, as if he found it hard to believe that an elderly spinster could unravel a murder. "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple said, gesturing to a chair. "I'm happy to help, though I'm sure you have everything well in hand." She listened as he outlined the facts. The bullet from Sir Henry's own pistol, the locked door, the absence of any sign of struggle. "A puzzling case," she said, her voice mild, "but puzzles, you know, are meant to be solved." As Katic spoke, Miss Marple's mind returned to Lady Eleanor, her composure, her brooch, her letters. There was a thread there, she was certain, one that connected the widow to the murder in ways yet unseen. People, she thought, are never quite what they seem, and grief, like a veil, can hide more than it reveals. With a quiet smile, she picked up her knitting, her needles clicking once more, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Chapter 3. The captain's burden. The afternoon light at Worthington Manor had softened into a mellow glow, filtering through the tall elms that lined the drive and casting dappled patterns across the gravel. The air carried the faint scent of mown grass and the distant bleat of sheep from the meadows beyond, a pastoral symphony that seemed at odds with the undercurrent of suspicion now permeating the house. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair in the manor's conservatory, her knitting a soft cascade of pale blue wool in her lap, observed the world with her usual deceptive mildness. Her spectacles glinted as she glanced toward the lawn, where Captain Reginald Blake paced with the restless energy of a caged animal, his cigarette smoke curling upward like a signal flare. There was something in his bearing part soldier, part prodigal, that intrigued her. a hardness beneath the charm that suggested depths yet to be plumbed. The conservatory, with its glass walls and profusion of ferns, was a haven of warmth and quiet, its atmosphere heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. Miss Marple had chosen it deliberately, knowing it offered a vantage point from which to observe the household's comings and goings without seeming to pry. Her fingers moved deftly, the needles clicking in a rhythm as steady as a metronome. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over the fragments of information she had gathered since her arrival. Lady Eleanor's diamond brooch and her guarded demeanour had set one thread in motion. Now, it was Captain Reginald Blake, Sir Henry's nephew and heir, who occupied her thoughts. A man with ambition, she mused, but ambition, like fire, can burn the hand that wields it. Reginald's presence at the manor was no accident. He had returned from India 6 months prior, his military career cut short by what the village gossip vaguely termed a spot of trouble. The details were murky, something about a gambling debt or a duel. Depending on the teller, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust such tales without corroboration. What was clear was that Sir Henry had taken him in, albeit with reservations, and that their relationship had been strained. The gardener, a garrulous man named Tompkins, had mentioned seeing Reginald near the manor's old well at midnight, carrying a sack that seemed heavier than mere rubbish. A soldier's habits, Miss Marple thought, or a sign of something less innocent. Her reverie was interrupted by the creak of the conservatory door. Reginald himself entered, his boots leaving faint traces of mud on the tiled floor. He was a striking figure, broad-shouldered and tanned, with dark hair swept back and eyes that held a glint of defiance. His tweed jacket was well cut but slightly worn at the cuffs, a detail Miss Marple noted with interest. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man used to command, "I didn't expect to find you here. Thought you'd be in the drawing-room with Aunt Eleanor, trading platitudes over tea." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle amusement. "Oh, I find the conservatory quite refreshing, Captain Blake. The air is so invigorating, and one can think so clearly among the plants. Do join me." She gestured to a chair opposite, her tone inviting but with a hint of steel beneath it, like a velvet glove concealing an iron grip. Reginald hesitated, then sat, crossing one leg over the other and lighting another cigarette. The match flared briefly, illuminating the faint scar that ran along his jaw, relic, perhaps, of his time in India. "You're a curious one," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "The village says you've a knack for solving puzzles." Uncle Henry would have been amused. He liked a challenge, though he rarely met one he couldn't master. "Sir Henry sounds like a formidable man," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing as she met his gaze. "It must have been difficult living in his shadow. I understand you had plans of your own ventures abroad, perhaps?" It was a gentle probe, but she watched his reaction closely, noting the way his fingers tightened around the cigarette. "Plans," Reginald said, his tone bitter. "That's one way to put it. Uncle Henry called them fool's errands. Said I'd squander the family fortune if he gave me half a chance. He wanted me to settle down, take up a desk job in London, play the dutiful heir." He laughed, a short, harsh sound, as if I'd trade the open road for a ledger and a tie. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes never leaving his face. "Family expectations can be such a burden," she said. "I knew a young man in St. Mary Mead, much like you, full of dreams, but his father thought them reckless. It caused such tension until, well, secrets have a way of coming out, don't they?" Her voice was soft, almost confiding, but the words were a net, cast with precision. Reginald's eyes narrowed slightly, but he took the bait. Secrets. If Uncle Henry had any, he kept them locked tighter than his study. All I know is he was obsessed with some old papers, nonsense from his Berlin days, kept them in a safe, wouldn't let anyone near them. He stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary, the ash scattering across the table. Not that it matters now. He's gone, and I'm stuck here, waiting for the solicitors to sort out the mess. The mention of the papers piqued Miss Marple's interest, but she filed it away for later. Instead, she shifted tack. "You must have seen a great deal in India," she said. "Such a vibrant place, but not without its dangers. I imagine it leaves a mark on a man." She gestured vaguely toward his scar, her expression one of innocent curiosity. Reginald touched the scar instinctively, then dropped his hand. "A souvenir," he said curtly. "A disagreement over cards. Nothing worth talking about." He rose, his movements abrupt. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I've got things to attend to. Estate business, you know." He nodded and strode out, leaving behind the faint scent of tobacco and a sense of unease. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind racing. Reginald's bitterness towards Sir Henry was palpable, but was it motive enough for murder? The papers he mentioned suggested a deeper game, one that might connect to Sir Henry's diplomatic past. And then there was the sack by the Weller detail that refused to fit neatly into the puzzle. "People," she murmured, "are such contradictory creatures." Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Katic, who had taken to consulting her with a mixture of respect and bemusement. He entered the conservatory, his notebook tucked under his arm, and offered a polite nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I've been going over the statements, and I thought you might have some insights." His tone was cautious, as if he half expected her to produce a solution from her knitting. "Bag, not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple said, setting her needles aside. "I'm always happy to lend an ear. What have you found?" She listened as he outlined the latest findings. The pistol, confirmed as Sir Henry's, had been wiped, clean of prints, save for a partial smudge that matched no one in the household. The study's lock showed no signs of tampering, and the window, though latched, bore a faint scratch on the framer detail Katic dismissed as irrelevant, but which Miss Marple noted with interest. "Captain Blake," Katic said, flipping through his notebook, "claims he was in his room the night of the murder, reading. No one can confirm it, but no one contradicts it either. He's got a temper, though Hargreaves mentioned an argument with Sir Henry a week ago, something about money." He looked at Miss Marple, his expression hopeful. "Anything strike you about him?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. "He's a man under pressure," she said, "ambitious but thwarted. I knew a boy like that once. In St. Mary me'd wanted to make his fortune in the colonies, but his uncle held the purse strings. It ended badly, I'm afraid. Money, you see, can be as dangerous as a loaded gun." She paused, then added, "Have you looked into his movements outside the house? Young men, like Captain Blake, often have diversions." Katic jotted a note, his brow furrowed. "I'll check with the village. There's a pub, the Blue Baum, might be worth asking if he's been seen there." He hesitated, then added, "You're sure you're not a detective, Miss Marple? You've a way of cutting to the quick." She laughed softly, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who listens, Inspector. People talk, and I pay attention." As Katic took his leave, she returned to her knitting, but her mind was elsewhere. turning over Reginald's scar, his bitterness, and the mysterious sack by the well. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll through the manor's grounds, her shawl draped over her shoulders and her step deceptively frail. The gardens were a riot of colour roses, delphiniums, and lavender swaying in the breeze, but her attention was drawn to the old well, half hidden by a copse of yews. It was an ancient structure, its stone moss-covered and its wooden cover warped by time. She paused, her eyes scanning the ground, and noticed a faint indentation in the grass, as if something heavy had been set down recently. "Curious," she murmured, her thoughts interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Miss Clara Henshaw appeared, her grey dress blending with the shadows of the US. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp with surprise. "What brings you here? The well's not safe, it's been boarded up for years." Her hands twisted a handkerchief, a nervous habit Miss Marple had observed before. "I was just admiring the grounds," Miss Marple said, her tone airy. "This well must have stories to tell. Old places always do." She watched Clara closely, noting the way her eyes darted toward the well before returning to Miss Marple's face. "It's nothing special," Clara said quickly. "Just a hazard. I should get back, lady. Eleanor needs me." She turned and hurried away, her steps brisk. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Fear, she thought, or guilt. That evening, at dinner, the household gathered in the dining room, its long tables set with silver and crystal that gleamed under the chandelier. Lady Eleanor presided with her usual cool detachment, her diamond brooch replaced by a jet mourning pin. Reginald was subdued, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Clara picked at her food, her silence almost palpable. Gretchen served, her movements precise and unobtrusive, but Miss Marple caught the brief glance she exchanged with Reginald a flicker of understanding, or perhaps complicity. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to the library, ostensibly to read, but in truth to reflect. The room was lined with leather-bound volumes, their spines embossed with gold, and a portrait of Sir Henry glowered from above the fireplace, his eyes stern even in oils. She settled into an armchair, her knitting bag at her side, and let her thoughts wander. Reginald's ambition, his argument with Sir Henry, the papers and the safe all pointed to a man with motive. But motive alone was not enough. The scratch on the window frame, the smudged print on the pistol, the sack by the Welvies were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. As the clock struck 10, she heard a soft creak outside the library door. Rising silently, she peered into the hall and saw Reginald slipping out the side entrance, a dark coat slung over his arm. A nocturnal errand, she thought, or something more. She made a mental note to mention it to Katic, then returned to her chair, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "People," she murmured, "carry their burdens like shadows, but shadows always lead back to the light." With that, she turned her thoughts to the next thread in the tapestry, Miss Clara Henshaw, whose nervous hands and furtive glances suggested a story yet untold. Chapter 4. The Governess's silence. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Worthington Manor like a shroud, softening the outlines of the ancient youth and muffling the distant call of a cuckoo in the woods beyond. Inside, the house was quiet, its grandeur tempered by the weight of recent tragedy. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a small, cheerful space with chintz curtains and a view of the rose garden, her knitting a soft heap of pale blue wool in her lap. The needles moved, with their usual precision, but her eyes, sharp and alert behind her spectacles, were fixed on the subtle currents of the household. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax and the memory of Sir Henry Worthington's cigars. A reminder of the man whose murder had drawn her into this intricate web of secrets. Miss Marple's thoughts were now focused on Miss Clara Hen, the governess, whose prim demeanour and nervous habits had begun to intrigue her. Clara was a woman who seemed to live on the edges of the manor's life, present but unobtrusive, like a shadow that moved without drawing attention. Yet shadows, Miss Marple knew, often concealed more than they revealed. Clara's 10 years at the manor suggested loyalty, but her guarded manner and the fleeting glances she cast toward the study hinted at something deeper: guilt, perhaps, or fear. The butler Hargreaves had mentioned seeing her wandering the corridors late at night, her footsteps pausing near Sir Henry's locked door. A governess, Miss Marple mused, is often privy to a household's secrets, whether she wishes to be or not. The morning room door opened, and Clara herself entered, carrying a tray with a fresh pot of tea and a plate of shortbread biscuits. She was a small woman, wiry and precise, her brown hair drawn tightly into a bun that seemed to pull her features into a perpetual frown. Her grey dress was immaculate, its high collar and long sleeves a testament to her rigid propriety, but her hands betrayed her fingers, twisting a plain cotton handkerchief, a nervous tic that Miss Marple had noted before. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice clipped but polite. "I thought you might like some tea. Lady Eleanor is occupied with the vicar, and the others are elsewhere." "How thoughtful of you, Miss Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her smile warm and disarming. "Do sit for a moment, won't you? It's so pleasant to have company on a misty morning like this." She gestured to a chair, her tone inviting, but with a subtle insistence that made refusal difficult. Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the door as if gauging the distance to escape, then sat, perching on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to take flight. "I've duties to attend to," she said, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief, "but I suppose I can spare a moment." Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, and handed Clara a cup. "You've been with the family, eh?" "Long time, I understand," she said, her voice conversational. 10 years is quite a commitment. You must have seen so many changes at the manor." It was a gentle opening, but her eyes were watchful, noting the slight stiffening of Clara's shoulders. "Yes, 10 years," Clara said, her gaze fixed on the teacup. "I came to look after Miss Violet, Sir Henry's ward. She was a sweet girl, but delicate. She passed 3 years ago consumption, the doctors said." Her voice was flat, but Miss Marple caught the faint tremor beneath it, as if the memory still carried pain. "That must have been difficult," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "Losing a child, even one not your own, leaves such a mark. And to stay on afterwards, your devotion to the family is remarkable." She paused, then added, "Though I imagine Sir Henry and Lady Eleanor relied on you greatly, especially in such a busy household." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "They were kind to keep me on," she said. "There was work to be done, correspondence, household accounts, that sort of thing. I made myself useful." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple sensed a defensiveness, as if Clara were justifying her presence to herself as much as to her listener. "Useful," Miss Marple echoed, her needles clicking softly. "That's a fine quality in a governess. I knew a young woman in St. Mary Mead, much like you're ever so efficient, but she carried a great deal on her shoulders. A secret, as it turned out, that weighed heavily. Secrets do, don't they?" Her voice was soft, almost confiding, but the words were a probe. Cast with the precision of a fisherman's line, Clara's hand jerked, and a drop of tea spilled onto her saucer. "Secrets," she said, her voice sharp. "I don't know what." "You mean, Miss Marple? My life is an open book, there's nothing to hide." But her eyes betrayed her, darting toward the window as if seeking an escape. And Miss Marple noted the faint flush that crept up her neck. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "I only meant that households like this one often have their complexities. Sir Henry, with his diplomatic work, must have been a man of many responsibilities. I imagine you saw a great deal, being so close to the heart of things." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes gentle but unrelenting. "His study, for instance, it must have been a place of great importance." Clara's cup clattered against the saucer, and she set it down with a force that belied her composure. "The study," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I had no business there. It was Sir Henry's private domain, locked, always locked. I never went near it." Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple's mind seized on the denial. "As telling as any confession." "Quite right," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "A man like Sir Henry would have valued his privacy. Though I suppose, in a house this size, one might pass by such a room without thinking, especially at night, when the corridors are so quiet." She let the words hang in the air, watching. As Clara's fingers twisted the handkerchief into a tight knot. "I keep to my room at night," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no reason to wander." She rose abruptly, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have tasks to attend to. The laundry maid needs supervision." Without waiting for a reply, she hurried. From the room, her footsteps echoing in the hall, Miss Marple sat back, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Denial," she murmured, "is often the loudest confession." Clara's reaction to the mention of the study confirmed Hargreaves's observation she had been seen near it, and not by chance. But why? Was she curious, complicit, or merely caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? The Governnesses passed, too, warranted scrutiny. The village schoolteacher, a font of local law, had mentioned Clara's abrupt departure from a previous post in Bath, a matter hushed up but not forgotten. A misunderstanding, Clara had called it, but Miss Marple knew that misunderstandings often cloaked deeper truths. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Katic, who entered with his usual air of earnest determination, his notebook worn at the edges from constant use. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a respectful nod, "I hope I'm not intruding. I've been digging into the household's routines, and I thought you might have some thoughts on Miss Henshaw. She's a bit of an enigma, don't you think?" "An enigma, indeed," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside. "A woman who sees much, but says little. What have you learned about her, Inspector?" She listened as Katic outlined Clara's statement. She had been in her room the night of the murder, reading a novel, and had neither seen nor heard anything unusual. Her alibi, like Reginald's, was unconfirmed but unchallenged, and her demeanor during questioning had been stiff but cooperative. "She's nervous," Katic said, flipping through his notes. "Kept twisting that handkerchief of hers, as if she'd rather be anywhere else. Hargreaves says she's been jumpy lately, especially since Sir Henry started locking his study more often." "Any ideas what that's about?" Miss Marple tilted, her head, her eyes thoughtful. "Nervousness can stem from many things," she said. "Guilt, fear, or simply the strain of living in a house where trust is scarce. I knew a governess once, in St. Mary, Mead Quiet, dependable, but she carried a burden from her past that made her wary. It came out, in the end, as such things do. Have you looked into Miss Henshaw's time before the manor? A decade here is a long time, but what came before might tell us more. Katic jotted a note, his brow furrowed. Good point. I'll wire Bath, see if there's anything on her previous post. Though I can't imagine a governess like her being mixed up in murder. She seems too proper. He looked at Miss Marple, his expression hopeful. Anything else strike you? Only that she avoids the study, Miss Marple said, her voice mild, or claims to. Yet Hargreaves saw her near it, and her denial was emphatic. People, you see, often protest most loudly when they're hiding something small, or something very large. She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that belied her frail appearance. Katic nodded, his skepticism giving way to respect. I'll keep an eye on her, he said. You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were running the investigation. He took his leave, promising to return with any new findings. Alone once more, Miss Marple rose and wandered to the window, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The mist was lifting, revealing the rose garden in all its glory, crimson and pink blooms swaying in the breeze. But her attention was drawn to Clara, who stood near a trellis, her head bent as she clipped dead roses with a pair of shears. Her movements were mechanical, but her eyes darted toward the manor, as if expecting to be watched. Fearful, Miss Marple thought, but of what? Or whom? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple took a turn about the grounds, her steps slow but purposeful. She paused near the greenhouse, where the gardener, Tompkins, was potting geraniums. He was a talkative man, eager to share his observations, and Miss Marple knew how to draw him out. Such a lovely garden, she said, her tone admiring. You must see so much, working here. I imagine Miss Henshaw enjoys it, too. She seems so fond of the roses. Tompkins wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes gleaming with the promise of gossip. Miss Henshaw? Aye, she's out here often, clipping and fussing. But she's been odd lately, jumpy-like. Saw her by the study window one evening, just standing there, staring. Didn't seem right, if you ask me. He lowered his voice, leaning closer. And there's talk she left her last place in a hurry. Something about a gentleman, though no one says much. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. People do talk, she said, though talk is often more noise than truth. Still, it's curious, isn't it? She thanked him and moved on, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. A gentleman in Bath, a hurried departure, and now a governess who lingered near a locked study. Each fragment added to the mosaic, but the pattern was not yet clear. At luncheon, the household gathered in the dining room, its heavy curtains drawn to keep out the midday sun. Lady Eleanor was composed, her conversation limited to the weather and the arrival of a condolence letter from a cabinet minister. Reginald was restless, his fingers drumming on the table, while Clara ate in silence, her eyes fixed on her plate. Gretchen served, her presence almost invisible, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands lingered on the silverware, as if memorizing its placement. The meal passed without incident, but the tension was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. After luncheon, Miss Marple retired to the library, a cavernous room with shelves of leather-bound books and a portrait of Sir Henry glowering from the mantel. She settled into an armchair, her knitting bag at her side, and let her thoughts wander. Clara's past, her nocturnal wanderings, her denial of interest in the study, all pointed to a woman with something to hide. But was it murder or something less sinister? The mention of a gentleman in Bath suggested a personal scandal, perhaps one Sir Henry had known and used to his advantage. Leverage, Miss Marple thought, is a powerful motive, but so is shame. Her reverie was broken by a soft tap at the door. Gretchen entered, carrying a duster and a cloth, her expression neutral. "I'm to clean the library, ma'am," she said, her accent faint but distinct. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her smile kindly. "You're very diligent, Gretchen. It must be a challenge, keeping such a large house in order." She watched the maid closely, noting the way her eyes swept the room, as if cataloguing its contents. "It's my job, ma'am," Gretchen said, moving to the shelves. "I'm used to it." She worked in silence, but Miss Marple sensed a watchfulness, a calculation that belied her subservient role. A maid, she thought, or something more. As Gretchen left, Miss Marple rose and examined the shelves, her fingers brushing the spines of diplomatic histories and memoirs. One book, a treatise on German politics, was slightly askew, its pages marked with a slip of paper bearing a single word: Berlin. "Curious," she murmured, her mind turning to Sir Henry's past and the secrets he had kept locked in his study. That evening, as the household retired, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting abandoned. The manor was silent, but the silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken fears of its occupants. Clara Henshaw, with her nervous hands and hidden past, was a thread in the tapestry, one that led back to the locked room and the man who had died. There, silence, Miss Marple thought, is a shield, but it can also be a trap. With that, she turned her thoughts to the next piece of the puzzle, certain that the truth, like a rose, would bloom in its own time. Chapter 5. The maid's discretion. The pale light of a late June dawn crept over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, bathing Worthington Manor in a soft, ethereal glow. The house stood silent, its Georgian facade imposing yet weary, as if burdened by the secrets it held. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and the lingering trace of lavender from the sachets tucked into the manor's linen cupboards. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her guest room with its chintz curtains and creaking floorboards, was already awake, her knitting a cascade of pale blue wool across her lap. Her spectacles glinted as she gazed out the window, her mind as active as the sparrows flitting in the garden below. The murder of Sir Henry Worthington had drawn her into a delicate dance of observation and deduction, and now her thoughts turned to the most enigmatic figure in the household, Gretchen Muller, the German maid whose quiet efficiency masked a watchfulness that Miss Marple found increasingly intriguing. Gretchen was a young woman of about 25, with fair hair braided neatly and a face that was pleasant but unremarkable, save for the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. She had arrived at the manor 6 months prior, recommended by a vague acquaintance of Sir Henry's, detail that, in itself, piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. In her brief interactions with the maid, Miss Marple had noted a precision in her movements, a fluency in her English that suggested education, and a faint accent that hinted at Berlin's sophisticated circles rather than a rural hamlet. There was something about Gretchen, her economy of speech, her ability to blend into the background, that reminded Miss Marple of a young woman she had once known in St. Mary Mead, a governess who had turned out to be far more than she seemed. Discretion, Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly, can be a mask, and masks are worn for a reason. The household was stirring now, the distant clatter of pans in the kitchen signalling the start of the day. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her shawl over her shoulders. and made her way to the morning room, where breakfast was laid out on a sideboard. Silver chafing dishes of kedgeree, scrambled eggs, and crisp bacon, flanked by a rack of toast and a pot of marmalade. Lady Eleanor was absent, attending to correspondence in the library, and Captain Reginald Blake had ridden into the village on some unspecified errand. Miss Clara Henshaw sat at the table, her grey dress as severe as ever, picking at a slice of toast with the air of someone who ate out of duty rather than pleasure. Gretchen moved silently about the room, refilling the teapot and clearing empty plates, her presence so unobtrusive that Clara scarcely acknowledged her. Miss Marple, taking a seat near the window, offered Gretchen a warm smile. "Good morning, Gretchen," she said, her tone kindly. "You're up early, as always. It must take great effort to keep a house like this running so smoothly." She watched the maid closely, noting the slight pause in her movements, as if the compliment had caught her off guard. "It's my duty, ma'am," Gretchen said, her voice even but with a trace of that refined accent. "I'm used to early mornings." She set a fresh cup of tea before Miss Marple, her hands steady but her eyes briefly meeting Miss Marple's, as if assessing her intent. "Duty is a fine thing," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea with a delicate clink of the spoon. "Though it must be quite a change, coming to England from Germany. The customs are so different, aren't they? I remember a German family in St. Mary Mead, such charming people, but they found our ways a bit puzzling at first." Her tone was conversational, but the words were a gentle probe, designed to elicit a reaction. Gretchen's smile was polite but fleeting, a flicker that did not reach her eyes. "I've adapted, ma'am," she said. "The work is much the same, wherever one is." She turned to clear a plate, her movements swift, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers lingered on the silver, as if memorizing its weight. Adaptable, Miss Marple thought, but not entirely at ease. As Gretchen left the room, Clara glanced up from her toast, her expression sour. "She's too quiet," she muttered, almost to herself. "Always watching, that one. I don't trust her." The words were unguarded, a rare lapse for the governess, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity. "Watching," she said, her tone one of mild surprise. "Why, I find her quite efficient. Though I suppose, in a house like this, one does notice things. You've been here so long, Miss Henshaw, you must see a great deal." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes gentle but piercing, and Clara flushed, realizing she had said more than she intended. "I didn't mean anything by it," Clara said quickly, crumbling her toast between her fingers. "It's just, the house feels different since Sir Henry's death. Everyone's on edge." She rose, smoothing her dress, and excused herself, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. The morning passed quietly, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She took a turn about the Manor's kitchen garden, ostensibly to admire the neat rows of herbs and vegetables, but in truth to observe Gretchen, who was hanging linens on a line near the scullery. The maid worked with practiced efficiency, her movements precise, but Miss Marple noted a subtle tension in her posture, as if she were listening for something beyond the rustle of the sheets. Approaching with her usual air of harmless curiosity, Miss Marple paused to comment on the lavender. "Such a lovely scent," she said. "You must find it soothing, Gretchen, after a long day's work." Gretchen turned, a damp sheet in her hands, and offered a small nod. "It's pleasant, ma'am," she said, "though I don't have much time for such things." Her tone was polite, but there was a wariness in her eyes, a guardedness that Miss Marple recognized from countless encounters with those who had something to conceal. "You're kept busy, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "A house this size must have its challenges, and with Sir Henry's works so many important visitors, I imagine. Did you ever meet any of them? Diplomats, perhaps? From his time abroad?" It was a delicate thrust, but Gretchen parried it with ease. "I'm only a maid, ma'am," she said, folding the sheet with care. "I don't meet guests. My work is in the background." She turned back to the line, her dismissal subtle but firm, and Miss Marple retreated, her mind turning over the exchange. In the background, she thought, but not invisible. Her suspicions were deepened later that afternoon when she overheard a fragment of conversation in the scullery. Pausing outside the door, her shawl draped over her shoulders, Miss Marple caught Gretchen's voice, low and urgent, speaking in German on the telephone. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, tense, almost secretive. "Ein Dokument, dringend, Berlin," Miss Marple heard, her schoolgirl German sufficient to catch the gist. "A document, urgent, Berlin." She filed the information. Away, her heart quickening at the implications. "A maid's duties," she murmured, "or a spy's?" Determined to learn more, Miss Marple sought out Hargreaves, the butler, whose long service at the manor made him a repository of its history. She found him in the pantry, polishing silver with a cloth that smelled faintly of ammonia. "Hargreaves," she said, her tone one of gentle inquiry, "you've been with the family a long time. I wonder if you could tell me about Gretchen. She seems so capable, but I know so little about her." Hargreaves paused, his hands steady but his eyes wary. "She's a good worker, ma'am," he said. "Came with a letter from a Mr. Schmidt, a friend of Sir Henry's from his Berlin days. Quiet, keeps to herself. Never had a complaint." He hesitated, then added, "Though she's curious, in her way. Caught her once in the library, looking at Sir Henry's books, diplomatic histories, they were. Said she was dusting, but it seemed odd." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. "Curious," she said. "Well, young people often are. Thank you, Hargreaves." She left him to his polishing, her mind racing. The library, the telephone call, the mention of Berlin all pointed to a woman whose role extended beyond the servants' hall. But how far, and to what end? At luncheon, the household gathered in the dining room, its long table set with crisp linen and silver that gleamed under the chandelier. Lady Eleanor presided with her usual cool authority, her conversation limited to the arrival of a condolence letter from a former ambassador. Reginald was absent, still in the village, while Clara ate in silence, her eyes fixed on her plate. Gretchen served, her movements precise and unobtrusive, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on the table, as if cataloguing its contents. The meal passed without incident, but the tension was palpable, a silent undercurrent that seemed to pulse with every clink of cutlery. After lunch, Miss Marple retired to the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and the heady scent of orchids. She settled into a wicker chair, her knitting resumed, and let her thoughts wander. Gretchen's background, her watchfulness, her knowledge of Germinal suggested a connection to Sir Henry's diplomatic past, perhaps to the papers Reginald had mentioned in the safe. The telephone call, with its mention of a document, was a thread that led to Berlin, a city Sir Henry had known well. A spy, Miss Marple thought, or simply a woman out of her depth. Either way, she is no ordinary maid. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Katic, who entered with his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression one of cautious optimism Miss Marple, he said, offering a respectful nod. I've been checking into the household. As you suggested, nothing concrete on Miss Henshaw's past yet, but I thought you might have some thoughts on the maid Gretchen, is it? She's a bit of a mystery. A mystery, indeed, Miss Marple said, setting her needles aside. A young woman who sees more than she says. What have you learned about her, Inspector? She listened as Katic outlined Gretchen's statement. She had been in the servants' quarters the night of the murder, mending linens, and had neither seen nor heard anything unusual. Her alibi was unconfirmed, like the others, but her demeanor during questioning had been conformed to calm, Katic noted. She's polite, but guarded, he said, flipping through his notes. Hargreaves says she's been asking questions about Sir Henry's visitors discreetly. Mind you, but it's unusual for a maid. Any ideas what that's about? Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. Curiosity can be a dangerous trait, she said, especially in a house where secrets are currency. I knew a maid once, in St. Mary Mead, quiet, efficient, but she had a knack for listening at doors. It led to trouble, in the end. Have you looked into Gretchen's references? A recommendation from a friend of Sir Henry's is all very well, but friends can have their own agendas. Katic jotted a note, his brow furrowed. I'll check with the agency that placed her, he said, though I can't see a maid. Like her being involved in murder she's too. Composed, he looked at Miss Marple, his expression hopeful. Anything else strike you? Only that she listens, Miss Marple said, her voice mild. And listening, in a house like this, can be as dangerous as speaking. Keep an eye on her, Inspector, but don't frighten her. A frightened bird flies, and we need her here. She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that belied her frail appearance. Katic nodded, his skepticism giving way to respect. I'll do that, he said. You've a way of cutting through the fog, Miss Marple. He took his leave, promising to return with any new findings. Alone once more. Miss Marple rose and wandered to the conservatory's glass wall, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The garden was a riot of colour roses, delphiniums, and lavender, swaying in the breeze, but her attention was drawn to Gretchen, who stood near the kitchen garden, speaking to a delivery boy. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were alert, scanning the grounds as if expecting to be watched. Watchful, Miss Marple thought, but for whom? Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple took a turn about the manor's library. A cavernous room with shelves of leather-bound books and a portrait of Sir Henry glowering from the mantel. She examined the diplomatic histories Hargreaves had mentioned, noting one voluminous study of German intelligence marked with a slip of paper bearing a coded sequence of numbers. A cipher, she murmured, her heart quickening. She replaced the book carefully, her mind racing. Was Gretchen seeking this, or something like it? And if so, why? That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Miss Marple observed Gretchen with renewed interest. The maid served with her usual precision, but Miss Marple caught the brief glance she exchanged with Lady Eleanor, flicker of understanding, or perhaps complicity. The dining room was heavy with silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery and Lady Eleanor's occasional remarks about the weather. Reginald, back from the village, was subdued, while Clara remained silent, her eyes fixed on her plate. After dinner, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting abandoned. The manor was quiet, but the silence was charged, filled with the unspoken fears of its occupants. Gretchen Muller, with her Berlin accent and watchful eyes, was a thread in the tapestry, one that led back to Sir Henry's past and the locked room where he had died. Discretion, Miss Marple thought, is a virtue, but it can also be a weapon. With that, she turned her thoughts to the next piece of the puzzle, certain that the truth, like a hidden cipher, would reveal itself. In time. Chapter 6. The locked room riddled. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen across the manicured lawns of Worthington Manor and gilding the stone urns that flanked its gravel drive. Within the manor, however, the warmth of the June evening did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting a soft cascade of pale blue wool in her lap, appeared as serene as ever, her spectacles glinting faintly in the lamplight. Yet her mind was far from idle, turning over the intricate puzzle of Sir Henry Worthington's murder with the precision of a watchmaker. The locked room, its door bolted, its window latched, and the key resting innocently on the desk beside. The body had become the fulcrum of the mystery, a challenge that demanded both logic and intuition to unravel. Miss Marple's observations of the household had already yielded a tapestry of motives and secrets. Lady Eleanor's guarded composure and mysterious letters suggested hidden alliances. Captain Reginald Blake's bitterness and nocturnal errands hinted at financial desperation. Miss Clara Henshaw's nervous denials and past indiscretions pointed to a woman under pressure, and Gretchen Muller's watchful efficiency and Berlin connections raised the spectre of espionage. Yet it was the mechanics of the crime itself, the seemingly impossible act of entering a locked room, firing a fatal shot, and escaping without trace, that now occupied her thoughts. A locked room, she murmured, her needles clicking rhythmically, is a stage, and every stage has its trapdoors. The drawing-room, with its heavy damask curtains and portraits of stern Worthington ancestors, was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. Lady Eleanor had retired early, pleading a headache, and Reginald was in the billiard-room, his cues clacking with a restless energy. Clara was nowhere to be seen, likely tending to some self-imposed task, while Gretchen moved silently through the house, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Miss Marple, left to her own devices, had requested a private meeting with Inspector Katic, who arrived promptly at 7, his notebook worn but ever present, his expression a blend of determination and mild exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her, "I've gone over the scene a dozen times, and I'm no closer to cracking it. The study was locked tight, door, window, everything. The key was inside, and there's no sign of tampering. Yet someone got in, shot Sir Henry, and got out without leaving a trace. It's enough to make a man believe in ghosts." His tone was half joking, but his eyes were earnest, seeking the insight he had come to value. Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle reassurance. "Ghosts are rarely so precise, Inspector," she said. "A bullet through the heart suggests a very human hand. Tell me, what have you found in the study itself?" "Every detail, no matter how small." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, and Craddock opened his notebook, grateful for her clarity. "The facts are straightforward," he began. "Sir Henry was found at his desk, slumped forward, a single bullet through his heart. The pistola Webley from his collection was on the floor beside him, wiped clean except for a partial smudge, not enough to identify. The bullet matches the pistol, and ballistics confirm it was fired at close range. The door was locked from the inside, the key on the desk. The window was latched, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no blood spatter beyond the body, no hidden panels or secret passages. We checked every inch." He paused, then added, "The only oddities are a faint scratch on the window frame and a trace of wax on the sill. Could be nothing old ware, maybe." Miss Marple's needles paused, and her lips pursed slightly. "Wax," she said softly, as if tasting the word, "and a scratch. Curious, don't you think? Wax has a way of betraying its user candlelight, ceiling, or something more theatrical." Her mind flashed to a play she had seen years ago in London, a melodrama involving a locked room and a clever trick with string and wax. "May I see the study, Inspector?" Sometimes the eye of an amateur catches what the professional overlooks. Katic hesitated, then nodded. "I don't see the harm. Come along, but mind you don't touch anything. It's still an active scene." He led her through the manor's corridors, their footsteps, muffled by thick carpets, to the study, a heavy oak door with a brass lock that gleamed dully in the lamplight. Unlocking it with a key from his pocket, he ushered her inside, and Miss Marple stepped into the room where Sir Henry had met his end. The study was a masculine domain, its walls lined with bookshelves and maps, its air heavy with the scent of leather and old cigar smoke. A mahogany desk dominated the center, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a photograph of Sir Henry in diplomatic regalia, his expression stern. The chair where he had died was pushed back slightly, and a chalk outline marked the floor where his body had fallen. The pistol was gone, secured as evidence, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the window, a tall sash affair with a sturdy latch, its frame solid but weathered. She moved closer, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and examined the window with care. The scratch Katic had mentioned was faint but unmistakable, a thin line etched into the wood near the latch, as if a tool had slipped during a delicate operation. The trace of wax on the sill was equally subtle, a pale smear that caught the light when she tilted her head. "Wax and a scratch," she murmured, her mind racing. She tested the latch, finding it firm but not immovable, and noted the slight give in the window frame, as if it had been manipulated recently. Turning to the desk, she studied the key, a heavy brass affair, its teeth worn but functional. The lock on the door was equally robust, with no signs of picking or force. Yet something about the scene felt staged, as if the killer had taken pains to create an illusion of impossibility. "A trick," she said softly, her eyes narrowing. "Not a ghost, but a conjurer." Katic watched her, his brow furrowed. "You think the window's the key, but it was latched, and the latch is inside. No one could have climbed out and secured it from the outside knot without leaving marks on the sill or the ground below. We checked the flower bed, no footprints, no disturbances." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The ground tells its own story, Inspector, but so does the window. A latch can be manipulated, string, wire, even a clever bit of wax to hold it in place. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, a theft, not a murder, but the principle was the same. The thief used a piece of fishing line to pull a latch shut after climbing out. It left a scratch, much like this one." She gestured to the window, her voice calm but certain. Katic's eyes widened, and he jotted a note. "Fishing line. That's a new one, but it'd take skill and nerve to pull it off in a murder. Who in the household could manage it? Lady Eleanor's too refined, Blake's a soldier, not a locksmith, and Miss Henchwell, she's hardly the type. The maid, maybe. She's nimble enough." "Gretchen," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral but her mind alert. "Yes, she has the dexterity and perhaps the knowledge, but we mustn't leap to conclusions. The trick is only part of the puzzle. Is the other, Sir Henry's pistol, you say where was it kept? In a locked cabinet, Katic said, pointing to a glass-fronted case in the corner, its door now ajar. Sir Henry had the only key on his watch chain. We found it with the body, and the cabinet was locked when we arrived. No signs of tampering there either. Miss Marple's lips pursed again. A locked cabinet, a locked room, and a key that never left its owner. Yet the pistol was used and returned to the floor. Someone had access. Inspector, someone who knew Sir Henry's habits, or who could bypass his precautions. She moved to the cabinet, noting its sturdy lock and the faint dust on its shelves, disturbed only where the pistol had rested. A key, she thought, or a skill with locks. Leaving the study, Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, her mind abuzz with possibilities. The wax and the scratch suggested a mechanical solution to the locked room, but the killer's identity remained elusive. Each suspect had the opportunity: Lady Eleanor's access to the house, Reginald's physicality, Clara's proximity, Gretchen's agility, but motive was the missing piece. Sir Henry's diplomatic past, with its whispers of German intelligence and sensitive documents, loomed large, and Miss Marple resolved to probe further. That evening, at dinner, the household gathered in the dining room, its long table set with silver and crystal that gleamed under the chandelier. Lady Eleanor presided with her usual detachment, her mourning pin glinting dully in the candlelight. Reginald was restless, his fingers drumming on the table, while Clara ate in silence, her eyes fixed on her plate. Gretchen served, her movements precise, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on the study door as she passed it, as if drawn by an invisible thread. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to the library, a cavernous room with shelves of leather-bound books and a portrait of Sir Henry glowering from the mantel. She settled into an armchair, her knitting bag at her side, and let her thoughts wander. The locked room was no longer a mystery in itself. The wax, the scratch, and the latch pointed to a trick, one that required skill but not superhuman cunning. Yet the killer's purpose remained obscure. Was it Lady Eleanor protecting a secret tied to her mysterious letters? Reginald, driven by financial need? Clara, hiding a past shame? Or Gretchen, whose Berlin connections suggested a deeper game? Her reverie was interrupted by a soft creak in the hall. Rising silently, she peered through the library door and saw Gretchen moving toward the study, a small metal tool in her hander. Hairpin, perhaps, or something more specialized. The maid paused, glanced around, then slipped into the shadows. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she made no move to follow. Patience, she thought, is the hunter's greatest weapon. Next morning, Miss Marple sought out Katic, finding him in the Manor's rose garden, where he was conferring with a constable. "Inspector," she said, her tone mild, "I've been thinking about that wax on the sill. It's not candle wax, I suspect too soft, too pliable. Sealing wax, perhaps, or something used to hold a string in place. Have your men searched the servants' quarters discreetly, mind you? A spool of thread, a wire, or even a hairpin might tell us more." Katic's eyes lit up, and he nodded. "I'll have it done today." "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. Most would have missed that. Wax entirely. Anything else I should know?" "Only that the study holds more than we've seen," Miss Marple said. "Sir Henry's papers those Reginald mentioned may be the key. A man like him didn't die for nothing. Look for a safe, Inspector, and watch who lingers near it." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that belied her frail appearance. Katic jotted a note, his respect for her growing. "A safe," he said. "I'll check the study again. If there's anything hidden, we'll find it." He took his leave, and Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room. Her knitting resumed, but her mind elsewhere. As the day progressed, she observed the household with renewed focus. Lady Eleanor was in the library, sorting letters with a distracted air. Reginald was in the stables, grooming a horse with unnecessary vigour. Clara was in the greenhouse, clipping herbs with trembling hands. And Gretchen was everywhere, dusting, serving, moving through the house like a ghost, her eyes always watching. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the study, the wax, the scratch, and the pistol. The locked room was no longer a barrier, but a window into the killer's mind that was clever, calculated, and dangerously close. That afternoon, she took a turn about the grounds, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her steps slow but purposeful. Pausing near the study window, she examined the flower bed below, noting the undisturbed soil but also a faint indentation in the grass, as if someone had stood there briefly. A careful killer, she thought, but not infallible. She glanced up at the window, imagining the string, the wax, the latcher. Simple trick, but one that required nerve and precision. She engaged Lady Eleanor in conversation, probing gently about Sir Henry's habits. He was so particular about his study, Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "Always locked, I hear. Did he ever mention anything unusual? Papers, perhaps, or visitors?" Lady Eleanor's hand paused on her teacup, but her reply was smooth. "Henry was private," she said. "His work was his own. If there were papers, they were routine diplomatic correspondence, nothing more." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, cool and unyielding, and Miss Marple smiled, conceding the round but not the game. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting abandoned. The manor was quiet, but the silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken fears of its occupants. The locked room had yielded its secretor trick, not a miracle, but the killer remained a shadow, moving among them. Gretchen's hairpin, desperation, Clara's fear, Eleanor's letters, all were threads in the tapestry, and Miss Marple knew that one tug would unravel the truth. A riddle, she thought, is only as strong as its weakest link. With that, she turned her thoughts to the next piece of the puzzle, certain that the manor secrets would not remain locked forever. Chapter 7. Whispers of the past. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed under a veil of twilight, its cottages aglow with lamplight, and the distant church bell tolling softly, as if reluctant to disturb the evening's peace. At Worthington Manor, however, the air was thick with unspoken tensions, each room a stage for the quiet dramas of its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the manor's library with her knitting a soft cascade of pale blue wool in her lap, appeared as tranquil as the village itself, her spectacles glinting faintly in the firelight. Yet her mind was a whirl of activity, piecing together the fragments of Sir Henry Worthington's murder with the patience of a seamstress stitching a delicate quilt. The locked room, with its wax-smeared sill and scratched window frame, had revealed a mechanical trick, but the motive behind the crime remained elusive, hidden in the shadows of the past. Miss Marple's observations of the household had painted a vivid tableau: Lady Eleanor's cool detachment and mysterious letters, Captain Reginald Blake's restless ambition and nocturnal wanderings, Miss Clara Henshaw's nervous denials and shadowed history, and Gretchen Muller's calculated discretion and Berlin connections. Each suspect was a thread in the tapestry, but the pattern was incomplete, and Miss Marple suspected that the key lay not in the present but in Sir Henry's diplomatic career that had spanned continents and left a trail of secrets. "The past," she murmured, her needles clicking rhythmically, "is never truly buried. It whispers, and those whispers can kill." The library was a cavernous space, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, and its air heavy with the scent of old paper and polished oak. A portrait of Sir Henry glowered from above the mantel, his eyes stern even in oils, and Miss Marple felt his presence keenly, as if he were watching her efforts to unravel his fate. She had spent the morning in the village, ostensibly to post a letter, but in truth to glean what she could from its font of gossip, the Blue Boar Inn, where the locals gathered over pints of ale and shared stories with the abandon of those who felt their words inconsequential. The innkeeper, a stout man named Perkins, had been particularly forthcoming, his tongue loosened by Miss Marple's gentle inquiries and a plate of his wife's excellent scones. Sir Henry was a big man in his day, Perkins had said, wiping a glass with a cloth that had seen better days. Berlin, Vienna, Rome, he knew 'em all. But there was talk, years back, of a scandal in Germany, something to do with secrets sold, or nearly sold. Hushed up, of course, but it left a mark. He came back to England after that, quieter, like he was carrying a weight. Perkins had leaned closer, his voice dropping. "And those papers he kept locked in his study, they say. Worth a fortune or a noose, depending on who got 'em." Miss Marple had nodded, her expression one of mild interest, but her mind had seized on the word scandal. A diplomatic incident, hushed up but not forgotten, could explain Sir Henry's preoccupation in his final months, as well as the interest in his papers. Returning to the manor, she had resolved to probe further, and now, in the library's quiet embrace, she turned her thoughts to the next step. The papers likely stored in a hidden safe, as Reginald had hinted were the linchpin, and their contents might illuminate the killer's motive. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Katic, who entered with his notebook. Tucked under his arm, his expression a blend of fatigue and determination. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a respectful nod, "I've been following your lead on the window trick. We found a spool of fine thread in the servants' quarters, Gretchen's room, to be precise. No fingerprints, but it's strong. Enough to pull a latch, just like you said. It's not proof, but it's something." His tone was hopeful, but his eyes sought her guidance, as if sensing the case's complexity. "A thread," Miss Marple said, her lips pursing slightly. "How fitting. A small thing, but it combined a great deal together. Well done, Inspector. Have you looked into Sir Henry's papers? I understand he kept sensitive documents, perhaps in a safe." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, and Katic flipped through his notes. "We searched the study again," he said. "Found a safe behind a panel, just as you thought. It's locked, and the key wasn't with Sir Henry's effects. We're waiting for a locksmith, but it's slow-going, specialized job, they say. The papers inside could be anything diplomatic. Correspondence, maybe, or something more dangerous." He hesitated, then added, "You think they're tied to the murder?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she tilted her head. "I think, Inspector, that Sir Henry died because of what he knew or what he held. A man like him, diplomats, you know, are collectors of secrets, would not be killed for nothing. Those papers may tell us why. Have you spoken to the Foreign Office? They might know of any entanglements from his time abroad." Her voice was mild, but the suggestion was pointed, and Katic jotted a note. "I'll wire London," he said, though they're cagey about that sort of thing. Any thoughts on who might have wanted those papers? Gretchen's looking likely, with that thread, but the others, Lady Eleanor, Blake, Miss Henshaw, they all had access to the house. Access? Yes, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. But motive is the key. I knew a man in St. Mary, Mead, a retired colonel, who kept letters from his time in Indian valuable, he thought, until someone tried to steal them. It was about shame, not money. Sir Henry's papers may hold a similar power over someone in this house, or beyond it. She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that belied her frail appearance. Katic nodded, his respect for her growing. I'll push on the safe and the Foreign Office. Anything else I should watch for? Only the small things, Miss Marple said. A glance, a hesitation, a word out of place. People betray themselves in the details, Inspector, and keep an eye on the study. Someone may try to reach those papers before your locksmith does. She resumed her knitting, and Katic took his leave, promising to return with any developments. Alone once more, Miss Marple rose and wandered to the library's shelves, her fingers brushing the spines of diplomatic histories and memoirs. One volume, a treatise on German politics, caught her eye, its pages marked with a slip of paper bearing a coded sequence numbers that suggested a cipher, perhaps related to the papers in the safe. She replaced the book carefully, her mind turning to Sir Henry's time in Berlin. The innkeeper's tale of a scandal secret sold, or nearly sold, pointed to a moment when Sir Henry had crossed paths with dangerous forces. A spy, she thought, or a traitor. Either way, the past has a long reach. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple ventured into the village again that afternoon. Her shawl draped over her shoulders, and her step deceptively frail. She visited the postmistress, Mrs. Cleary, a sharp-eyed woman who knew every letter that passed through St. Mary Mead. Over a cup of tea in the cramped post office, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Sir Henry's correspondence. He must have received such interesting letters, she said, her tone casual. From all over, I imagine, with his diplomatic work. Mrs. Cleary's eyes gleamed with the promise of gossip. Oh aye, he did, she said. Most were from London Whitehall, you know, but there were others, foreign ones, in the last year. German postmarks, some of M, and one or two with a funny crest, like a bird with a crown. Sir Henry was particular about M. Came himself to collect, wouldn't trust the boy. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. And lately, he was sending letters to a Mr. Schmidt in Berlin. Same name as the man who recommended the maid, that Gretchen. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained one of mild interest. How curious, she said, though I suppose diplomats never truly retire. Thank you, Mrs. Cleary. She left the post office, her mind racing. Mr. Schmidt, Gretchen's recommender, was a link to Berlin and to Sir Henry's past. The crested bird with a crown suggested a connection to Prussian nobility, or perhaps an intelligence network. Whispers, she thought, that echo across years. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought out Hargreaves, the butler, finding him in the pantry, arranging crystal decanters with a care that bordered on reverence. Hargreaves, she said, her tone gentle, you've seen so much in your years. Here, I wonder if Sir Henry ever spoke of his time in Berlin. It must have been such a fascinating post. Hargreaves paused, his hands steady but his eyes guarded. He rarely spoke of it, ma'am, he said. But there was a time, about a year ago, when he had a visitor, a German gentleman, older, with a limp. They talked in the study, late. Into the night. Sir Henry was agitated after, started locking his papers away, more than usual. He hesitated, then added, "The gentleman's name was Schmidt, I believe." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite curiosity. "How interesting," she said. "Thank you, Hargreaves." She left him to his decanters, her thoughts turning to Gretchen. The maid's arrival, 6 months ago, coincided with Sir Henry's renewed interest in his papers, coincidence that Miss Marple found increasingly unlikely. A thread, she thought, that ties the past to the present. That evening, at dinner, the household gathered in the dining room, its long table set with silver and crystal that gleamed under the chandelier. Lady Eleanor was composed, her conversation limited to the memorial service planned for Sir Henry. Reginald was restless, his eyes darting to the study door, while Clara ate in silence, her hands twisting her napkin. Gretchen served, her movements precise, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on the portrait of Sir Henry, as if searching for something in his painted eyes. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to the conservatory, a glass-walled haven, filled with ferns and the heady scent of orchids. She settled into a wicker chair, her knitting resumed, and let her thoughts wander. The scandal in Berlin, the papers in the safe, the visitor named Schmittel pointed to a secret that had followed Sir Henry home. Gretchen's connection to Schmidt, her watchfulness, her skill with the window latch each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was not yet clear. A spy, Miss Marple thought, or a pawn in a larger game. Either way, the past is the key. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft rustle outside the conservatory. Rising silently, she peered through the glass and saw a figure moving across the lot. Reginald, his coat slung over his arm, heading toward the old well. He paused, glancing back at the manor, then disappeared into the shadows. Miss Marple, lips pursed. Another errand, she thought, or another secret. She made a mental note to mention it to Katic, then returned to her chair, her needles clicking once more. The next morning, Miss Marple sought out the village's retired clerk, Mr. Harrow, a former Foreign Office man who had settled in St. Mary Mead to tend his roses. She found him in his garden, pruning a climbing vine with a pair of well-worn shears. "Mr. Harrow," she said, her tone one of gentle admiration, "your roses are a credit to the village. I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment. I'm curious about Sir Henry Worthington's time in Berlin. You must have known him in his Foreign Office days." Harrow straightened, his eyes narrowing but his smile polite. "Sir Henry, yes," he said. "A fine diplomat, though a cautious one. Berlin was a difficult post. There was an incident, 20 years back, a leak, they called it. Documents went missing, nearly reached the wrong hands. Sir Henry was cleared, but it cost him. He left Berlin soon after, and some said he kept evidence papers, names to protect himself." He paused, then added, "If those papers still exist, they'd be dangerous. To the wrong people, deadly." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. "How fascinating," she said, "though I suppose such things are best left in the past. Thank you, Mr. Harrow." She left him to his roses, her mind racing. The leak, the papers, the scandal all converged on Sir Henry's study and on the safe that held his secrets. Whispers, she thought, that someone wanted silenced. Back at the manor, Miss Marple observed the household with renewed focus. Lady Eleanor was in the morning room, sorting condolence letters with a distracted air. Reginald was in the billiard room, his cues clacking with unnecessary force. Clara was in the greenhouse, clipping herbs with trembling hands, and Gretchen was everywhere, dusting, serving, moving through the house like a ghost, her eyes always watching. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the safe, the papers, and the scandal that had followed Sir Henry from Berlin. The locked room was no longer the mystery. The trick was clear, but the motive was a shadow, cast by the past. At tea, she engaged Clara in conversation, probing gently about Sir Henry's visitors. He must have had such interesting guests, Miss Marple said, her tone casual. From his diplomatic days, perhaps. I imagine you saw a great deal, being so close to the household. Clara's hand jerked, and her teacup rattled in its saucer. But her reply was curt. I didn't concern myself with guests, she said. My duties were elsewhere. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, wary and defiant, and Miss Marple smiled, conceding the round but not the game. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting abandoned. The manor was quiet, but the silence was charged, filled with the echoes of a scandal that had never truly died. The papers in the safe, the visitor named Schmidt, the leak in Eleanor were threads in the tapestry, and Miss Marple knew that. One tug would unravel the truth. The past, she thought, is a mirror, and it shows us who we are. With that, she turned her thoughts to the next piece of the puzzle, certain that the manor's secrets would soon be laid bare. Chapter 8. The Midnight Encounter. The night had draped Worthington Manor in a velvet hush, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl in the distant woods and the soft creak of the house settling into its ancient bones. The moon, a slender crescent, cast a faint silver glow across the lawns, illuminating the gravel paths and the dark silhouette of the old well near the yew copse. Inside, the manor's corridors were dim, the lamps turned low, and the air carried the lingering scent of beeswax and the faint, acrid trace of Captain Reginald Blake's cigarettes. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her bedroom window with her knitting, abandoned on the table, was wide awake, her sharp eyes scanning the grounds below. Sleep, she had long ago learned, was a luxury often sacrificed to observation, and tonight her instincts told her that the manor's secrets were stirring. The past few days had woven a complex tapestry of clues, Lady Eleanor's cryptic letters, and guarded poise, Reginald's financial desperation and restless movements, Clara Henshaw's nervous evasions and shadowed past, and Gretchen Muller's calculated discretion and ties to Berlin. The locked room, with its wax-smeared sill and scratched window frame, had yielded the secret of a mechanical trigger string or wire to secure the latch from outside. But the motive for Sir Henry Worthington's murder remained a shadow, rooted in his diplomatic past and the papers locked in his study's hidden safe, the whispers of a Berlin scandal, a leak of secrets, and a mysterious Mr. Schmidt had deepened the mystery. And Miss Marple sensed that the truth was close, waiting for a single moment of revelation. Her vigil was prompted by a restlessness she had felt since dinner, where the household's tensions had been palpable. Lady Eleanor had been unusually silent, her eyes fixed on a distant point as if wrestling with an unseen burden. Reginald had been irritable, snapping at the footman over a spilled glass of wine, while Clara had barely touched her food, her hands twisting her napkin into knots. Gretchen, serving with her customary precision, had moved like a spectre, her green eyes catching the candlelight with an intensity that Miss Marple found unsettling. After dinner, as the others retired, Miss Marple had lingered in the drawing-room, ostensibly to finish a chapter of her novel, but in truth to listen to the house, the creaks, the whispers, the soft footfalls that betrayed its sleepless occupants. Now, As the clock in the hall chimed midnight, her patience was rewarded. A shadow moved across the lawn, swift and purposeful, heading toward the old well. Miss Marple leaned forward, her spectacles glinting, and recognized the broad shoulders and military stride of Captain Reginald Blake. He wore a dark coat, its collar turned up, and carried a small bundle, perhaps a sack, though smaller than the one the gardener had described. He paused near the well, glancing back at the manor, then crouched, as if examining the ground or concealing something. A moment later, another figure emerged from the shadows, a man. Unfamiliar, his hat pulled low and his movements cautious. The two spoke in low tones, their words indistinguishable but their gestures urgent, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A meeting," she murmured, "and not a friendly one." She strained to hear, catching only fragments, payment and documents, before the stranger handed Reginald a small packet, perhaps an envelope, and slipped back into the darkness. Reginald stood, tucking the packet into his coat, and made his way back to the manor, his steps brisk but stealthy. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. The well, the sack, the midnight rendezvous well pointed to Reginald's involvement in something beyond mere financial strain. Documents, she thought, and payment. A transaction, but for what? Determined to act, she rose, slipping into her shawl and soft-soled shoes, and moved silently into the corridor. The manor was a labyrinth of shadows, its oak-panelled walls absorbing sound, but Miss Marple's years of quiet observation had honed her senses. She descended the back stairs, avoiding the creaking third step, and emerged near the servants' entrance, where the night air was cool and damp. The lawn stretched before her, silvered by moonlight, and she made her way to the well, her steps slow but deliberate, as if out for a midnight stroll to clear her head. The well was an ancient structure, its stone moss-covered and its wooden cover warped by time. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the grass, and found a faint indentation where Reginald had crouched, a sign of recent disturbance. Near the base of the well, half hidden by weeds, she spotted a scrap of paper, its edges torn and its surface smudged with dirt. She retrieved it carefully, holding it to the moonlight. The paper bore a series of numbers 3, 7, 9, 2 and a single word in German, Schlüssel, key. She translated, her schoolgirl German rusty but adequate. Her heart quickened. A cipher, perhaps, or a code related to the safe in Sir Henry's study. Reginald, she thought, is playing a dangerous game. She tucked the paper into her sleeve and returned to the manor, her mind abuzz with possibilities. The encounter suggested that Reginald was entangled in a scheme involving Sir Henry's papers, perhaps selling them to the stranger, or acting as a courier. The word documents echoed the whispers of a Berlin scandal, and the German cipher linked back to Gretchen's telephone call and her connection to Mr. Schmidt. A network, Miss Marple thought, and Reginald is a link, but not the mastermind. Back in her room, she sat by the window, her knitting untouched, and considered her next move. Confronting Reginald directly was unwise. He was volatile and likely to deny everything. Instead, she resolved to share her findings with Inspector Katic, whose diligence, if not his imagination, could be relied upon. The cipher, the well, the stranger roar were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to the safe and its contents. But who else was involved? Gretchen, with her Berlin ties, was a likely candidate, but Lady Eleanor's letters and Clara's evasions could not be dismissed. The next morning, Miss Marple sought out Katic, finding him in the manor's rose garden, where he was examining the flower bed beneath the study window for further clues. "Inspector," she said, her tone mild but urgent. I have something to share, but it must be in confidence. The grounds are not as quiet as they seem. She recounted the midnight encounter, omitting no detail: the shadow, the stranger, the words payment and documents, and the scrap of paper with its German cipher. She handed him the paper, her fingers steady despite the gravity of her discovery. Craddock's eyes widened, and he studied the paper, his brow furrowed. "This is extraordinary, Miss Marple," he said. "Blake meeting someone at midnight. And this codit could be the key to the safe, or something else entirely. I'll have my men search the well discreetly, and I'll question Blake, though he's slippery as an eel." He paused, then added, "You're sure it was German? That points to the maid, doesn't it?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. "It points to Berlin," she said, "but we mustn't leap, Inspector. A cipher can be used by anyone with knowledge, and Reginald's no scholar. Someone may be guiding him more, using him. Keep an eye on the study and on the safe. If those papers are as valuable as we suspect, others may try to reach them." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that belied her frail appearance. Craddock nodded, his respect for her deepening. "I'll get on it," he said, "and I'll check with the Foreign Office again. Those papers might be tied to the Berlin leak you mentioned. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. Most would have slept through that meeting." He took his leave, clutching the paper, and Miss Marple returned to the manor. Her knitting resumed, but her mind elsewhere. At breakfast, the household gathered in the morning room, its chintz curtains drawn to let in the pale sunlight. Lady Eleanor was composed, her mourning pin glinting dully, but her hands betrayed a faint tremor as she poured tea. Reginald was subdued, his eyes shadowed, as if he had slept poorly or not at all. Clara picked at her toast, her fingers twisting her handkerchief, while Gretchen served, her movements precise but her gaze lingering on Reginald, as if sensing his unease. Miss Marple observed them all, her expression one of gentle sympathy, but her mind was a steel trap, cataloguing every glance, every hesitation. After breakfast, she took a turn about the grounds, her shawl draped over her shoulders, ostensibly to admire the roses, but in truth to revisit the well. The indentation was still there, but no new clues presented themselves, and she suspected Craddock's men would find little unless they dredged the well itself, a task she hoped they would undertake with care. Her thoughts turned to the stranger, his hat, his limp, his urgency. Was he Schmidt, the man who had recommended Gretchen, or another player in a game that spanned continents? Determined to probe further, Miss Marple sought out the village telegraph office, where she sent a discreet inquiry to a friend in London, a retired archivist with access to Foreign Office records. "Dear Mr. Langley," she wrote, "I am curious about a diplomatic incident in Berlin circa 1905 involving Sir Henry Worthington. Any details, however small, would be most appreciated." She signed it with her usual flourish, knowing that Langley's penchant for gossip rivaled her own for observation. Back at the manor, she engaged Clara in conversation, probing gently about Reginald's habits. "He's such a restless young man," Miss Marple said, her tone casual, as they sat in the conservatory amid the ferns and orchids, "always coming and going. I imagine you see a great deal, Miss Henshaw, being so attentive to the household." Clara's hand jerked, and her teacup rattled, but her reply was curt. "I don't concern myself with Captain Blake," she said. "He keeps his own hours." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, wary and defiant, and Miss Marple smiled, conceding the round but noting Clara's discomfort. Fearful, she thought, but of Reginald, or something he knows. At luncheon, the household was subdued, the weight of the investigation pressing on them all. Lady Eleanor spoke of the memorial service, her voice flat, while Reginald pushed his food around his plate, his eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Clara was silent, her hands hidden beneath the table, and Gretchen served with a stillness that seemed almost predatory. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the cipher Schlüssel, the key. Was it literal, a key to the safe, or figurative, a code to unlock Sir Henry's secrets? That afternoon, she visited the library, examining the diplomatic histories for further clues. A volume on German intelligence, tucked among the others, bore a faint pencil marker circle around the name Schmidt, with a date, 1905. Her heart quickened. The Berlin scandal, the leak, the papers all converged on this name, and on Gretchen's arrival at the manor. A connection, she thought, but not the whole story. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting resumed, and let her thoughts wander. The midnight encounter had shifted the puzzle, placing Reginald at its centre but not its heart. The stranger, the cipher, the documents all pointed to a larger scheme, one that reached back to Berlin and forward to the safe in the study. Gretchen's role was clearer now, but Lady Eleanor's letters and Clara's evasions suggested other threads, other motives. A transaction, Miss Marple thought, but who is the buyer and who the seller? Her reverie was broken by a soft tap at the door. Hargreaves entered, his face pale. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "the inspector's found something in the Weller metal box, locked tight. He's asking for you." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. "Thank you, Hargreaves," she said, rising. "I'll come at once." As she followed him through the manor, her knitting bag slung over her arm, she felt the puzzle tightening, its pieces falling into place. The box, the cipher, the safe fall were keys, and the truth was within reach. People, she thought, meet in the dark, but the light always finds them. With that, she stepped into the night, ready to face the next revelation. Chapter 9. The Governess's Confession. The morning at Worthington Manor dawned with a deceptive calm. The sky a pale wash of blue streaked with wisps of cloud, and the air heavy with the scent of dew-soaked roses. Inside, however, the atmosphere was taut, each creak of the floorboards and murmur of voices carrying the weight of unspoken fears. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting a soft heap of pale blue wool in her lap, appeared. As serene as the village beyond, her spectacles glinting faintly in the sunlight. Yet her mind was a whirl of deduction, piecing together the intricate puzzle of Sir Henry. Worthington's murder with the precision of a lace-maker crafting an heirloom. The locked rooms, trick-a-wire or string manipulating the latch, betrayed by wax and a scratch, had been unravelled. But the motive remained elusive, woven into the secrets of the household and the shadows of Sir Henry's diplomatic past. The midnight encounter at the Old Well had shifted the investigation's focus, with Captain Reginald Blake's clandestine meeting and the German cipher Schlüssel, Orkey, suggesting a scheme involving Sir Henry's papers. The metal box found in the well, locked and unopened, hinted at further secrets, possibly tied to the Berlin scandal of 1905, when a leak of documents had nearly ruined Sir Henry's career. Gretchen Muller's Berlin connections and her deftness with locks made her a prime suspect, but Miss Marple's instincts told her the truth was not so singular. Lady Eleanor's mysterious letters, Reginald's desperation, and Miss Clara Henshaw's nervous evasions each added a thread to the tapestry. And it was Clara, the governess, who now occupied Miss Marple's thoughts. Her denials about the study, her nocturnal wanderings, and her guarded past suggested a woman caught in a web of her own making, and Miss Marple sensed that a gentle push might loosen her tongue. The conservatory, with its glass walls and profusion of ferns, was a haven of warmth and quiet, its air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. Miss Marple had chosen it deliberately, knowing it offered privacy for delicate conversations, and she had invited Clara for a morning chat under the guise of discussing the manor's rose garden. Clara entered, her grey dress as severe as ever, her brown hair pulled tightly into a bun that seemed to strain her features. Her hands, as always, clutched a cotton handkerchief, twisting it with a nervous energy that Miss Marple noted with interest. "Good morning, Miss Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her smile warm and disarming. "Do sit down. I thought we might talk about the roses there, so lovely this time of year, and I hear you're quite the gardener." Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as if seeking an escape, then perched on the edge of a wicker chair, her posture rigid. "The roses are fine," she said, her voice clipped. "I tend them when I can, but I have duties to attend to, Miss Marple. Is there something specific you wanted?" Her tone was polite but edged with impatience, and Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Defensive, she thought, but brittle. "Oh, nothing urgent," Miss Marple said, pouring tea from a pot on the side table and handing Clara a cup. "I find gardening so soothing, don't you? It's like life, one must be patient, attentive, and sometimes prune away what's harmful. You've been here 10 years, Miss Henshaw, long time to tend to a household's needs. You must know its rhythms better than anyone." Her voice was soft, almost confiding, but her eyes were sharp, watching Clara's reaction. Clara's fingers tightened on the handkerchief, and a drop of tea spilled onto her saucer. "I do my work," she said, her gaze fixed on the cup. "The family has been kind to me. I don't pry into their affairs." The words were rehearsed, but her voice trembled, and Miss Marple sensed a crack in her armour. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "Loyalty is a fine quality, but a house like this, with its history, must hold so many stories. Sir Henry, for instance, such a distinguished man, with his diplomatic work. I imagine you saw a great deal, being so close to the heart of things. His study, perhaps, where he kept his important papers." She leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but relentless, and Clara's cup clattered against the saucer. "The study," Clara said, her voice rising. "I told you, I never went near it. It was locked, always locked. Sir Henry was private, and I respected that." Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple's mind seized on the panic beneath them, as telling as any confession. "Quite right," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "A man like him would value his privacy, though I suppose, in a house this size, one might pass by such a room without thinking, especially at night, when the corridors are so quiet. Hargreaves mentioned seeing you there once, near the study door. An innocent moment, I'm sure, but curious, don't you think?" Her voice was soft, but the words were a net cast with precision, and Clara's face paled. "Hargreaves is mistaken," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep to my room at night. There's no reason to wander." Her hands twisted, the handkerchief into a tight knot, and Miss Marple saw the strain in her eyes, the fear of a cornered creature. People make mistakes, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. And fear makes us see shadows where there are none. I knew a young woman in St. Mary Mead, much like you, loyal, dutiful, but she carried a secret that weighed on her. A small thing, really, but it grew until it consumed her. Secrets do that. Miss Henshaw, they fester, unless they're shared. She paused, letting the silence press against Clara's defenses, and saw the moment when they crumbled. Clara's shoulders slumped, and a sob escaped her, muffled by the handkerchief she pressed to her mouth. I didn't kill him, she whispered, her voice breaking. I swear it, Miss Marple, I didn't. But I did something wrong, and he knew it. Sir Henry, he used it against me. Her words tumbled out, halting and raw, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression one of gentle encouragement. Go on, my dear, she said. The truth is a burden, but it's lighter when shared. What did Sir Henry know? Her voice was kind, but her mind was alert, cataloguing every word. Every tremor. Clara took a shuddering breath, her eyes fixed on the floor. It was years ago, in Bath, she said. My first post as a governess. There was a gentleman, a friend of the family. He was kind, attentive, and I was young foolish. We grew close, too close. It was innocent, at first, but there was talk, and I was dismissed. No one would say it outright, but the scandal followed me. Sir Henry found out. He had ways, you know, of digging into people's pasts. When Violet died, he kept me on, but not out of kindness. He wanted me to watch Lady Eleanor, to read her letters, to report anything unusual. Her voice cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks. I had no choice. He'd have ruined me, sent me away without a reference. Miss Marple's needles paused, and her lips pursed slightly. Blackmail, she thought, a diplomat's tool, turned against his own household. Aloud, she said, that must have been terribly difficult, Miss Henshaw, to be caught between loyalty and fear. Did you find anything in Lady Eleanor's letters? Something Sir Henry wanted to know. Clara nodded, her hands trembling. There were letters from London, a man, someone important. Sir Henry thought she was involved with him, or planning something. He wanted proof, but I never found anything definite. Just hints, names, places. I gave him what I could, but it was never enough. He was angry, said I was useless. She looked up, her eyes pleading. I hated it, Miss Marple, hated myself, but I didn't kill him. I couldn't. Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara's hand with a gentleness that belied the steel in her mind. I believe you, my dear, she said. You've carried a heavy load. But tell me, did you see anything the night Sir Henry died? Anything that might help us understand what happened? Her tone was soft, but her eyes were unrelenting, searching for the truth in Clara's tear-streaked face. Clara hesitated, then nodded, her voice barely audible. I couldn't sleep, she said. I was in the corridor near the study, not spying, just restless. I saw Gretchen, late, after midnight. She was coming from the study, or near it. She had something in her hand, a tool, small, like a wire or a hairpin. She didn't see me, but I hid, frightened. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was wrong. Her words faltered, and she buried her face in her handkerchief, sobbing quietly. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. Clara's confession was a revelation, not of murder, but of coercion, glimpse into Sir Henry's methods and the pressures that bound the household. Gretchen's presence near the study, with a tool that matched the window trick, was a damning clue. Yet Miss Marple cautioned herself against haste. Clara's fear was genuine, but her story left gaps. Why was she restless that night? And what else had she seen? Truth, Miss Marple thought, is a mosaic, and we have another piece. "Thank you, Miss Henshaw," she said, her voice kind. "You've been very brave. Rest now, and don't speak of this to anyone, not yet. We're close to the truth, but we must be careful." Clara nodded, her sobs subsiding, and left the conservatory, her steps unsteady but lighter, as if unburdened by her confession. Alone, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. Clara's story confirmed Sir Henry's ruthlessness, his use of secrets to control those around him. Lady Eleanor's letters, watched by Clara, suggested a motive tied to infidelity or intrigue. But Gretchen's role was clearer, now a spy, perhaps using her skills to enter the study and silence Sir Henry before he could expose her. Yet Reginald's midnight meeting and the cipher in the well pointed to a broader conspiracy, one that might involve all four suspects in ways yet unseen. Determined to share her findings, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Katic, finding him in the Manor's library, where he was examining the safe with a locksmith. The metal box from the well, he reported, was still locked, its contents unknown until a specialist could be summoned. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of relief and frustration, "we're making progress, but it's slow. That cipher you found, Schlussel, it's got us thinking about the safe. The locksmith says it's a combination lock, and those numbers might be the key. Any new thoughts?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her eyes sharp. "I've spoken to Miss Henshaw," she said, her voice low. "She's confessed to an indiscretion in her past, used by Sir Henry to coerce her into spying on Lady Eleanor's correspondence. She saw Gretchen near the study the night of the murder, holding a tool, possibly a wire. It's not proof, Inspector, but it's a step closer. We must watch Gretchen carefully, but discreetly. And the safe, those papers are the heart of this, I'm sure." She recounted Clara's story, omitting no detail, and Katic's eyes widened, his notebook filling with hasty scrawls. "Blackmail," he said, shaking his head. "Sir Henry was a piece of work, and Gretchen with a wire that fits your window trick perfectly. I'll have her questioned, but we'll need more than Clara's word. The safe's our best bet. If we can crack it, we might find the motive." He paused, then added, "You're a wonder, Miss Marple. Most would have missed Clara's nerves, let alone gotten her to talk." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "People talk, Inspector, when they're ready. And nerves, like threads, unravel with a gentle tug. Keep an eye on Reginald. To his meeting at the well suggests he's not innocent. The papers, the cipher, the boxel point to a secret worth killing for." She left him to his work. Returning to the conservatory, her knitting resumed, but her mind elsewhere at luncheon. The household gathered in the dining room, its heavy curtains drawn to keep out the midday sun. Lady Eleanor was composed, her conversation limited to the vicar's visit, but her hands betrayed a faint tremor. Reginald was restless, his eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, while Clara ate in silence, her face pale but her hands steady for the first time. Gretchen served, her movements precise, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on Clara, as if sensing a shift in the governess's demeanour. The meal passed without incident, but the tension was palpable, a silent storm gathering strength. After luncheon, Miss Marple took a turn about the grounds, her shawl draped over her shoulders, ostensibly to admire the lavender, but in truth to reflect. Clara's confession had illuminated Sir Henry's methods: blackmail, manipulation, control, but it also raised questions. Why had Gretchen risked entering the study that night? Was she after the papers or something else? And how did transaction at the well fit with Lady Eleanor's letters? The Berlin scandal, with its leak and its aftermath, was the key. But the players Schmidt-Gretchen, the stranger, remained shadows. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple visited. The village schoolteacher, Miss Price, a woman with a sharp memory for local history. Over tea in her cosy parlour, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Sir Henry's visitors. He must have had such interesting guests, she said, her tone casual. From his diplomatic days, perhaps. I imagine you heard of them, living so close to the manor. Miss Price's eyes gleamed with the promise of gossip. Oh yes, she said. There was one, about a year ago, a German gentleman, older, with a limp. Stayed a night, caused a stir. Sir Henry was cross after, locked himself in his study for days. Folks said it was about old business Berlin, maybe. The man's name was Schmidt, I think. She leaned closer, her voice dropping, and that made Gretchen. She came soon after. Odd, don't you think? Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. Very odd, she said, though coincidences do happen. Thank you, Miss Price. She left the parlour, her mind racing. Schmidt, the visitor, the papers, all converged on Gretchen. But Clara's confession suggested a household where everyone was compromised, each with a motive to silence Sir Henry. Back at the manor, Miss Marple observed the household with renewed focus. Lady Eleanor was in the morning room, sorting letters with a distracted air. Reginald was in the stables, grooming a horse with unnecessary vigour. Clara was in the greenhouse, clipping herbs with a steadiness that belied her earlier tears. And Gretchen was everywhere, dusting, serving, moving through the house like a ghost, her eyes always watching. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the safe, the cipher, and the box in the well. The truth was close, but it required one final push-a-trap, perhaps, to flush out the killer. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in the library, her knitting abandoned. The manor was quiet, but the silence was charged, filled with the echoes of Clara's confession and the secrets it had exposed. Gretchen's role was clearer, but the others, Reginald, Eleanor, even Clary, were not innocent. The papers, in the safe, the Berlin scandal, the cipher, all were keys, and Miss Marple knew that the next move would unlock the truth. Confession, she thought, is a crack in the wall, and through it we see the light. With that, she turned her thoughts to the final act, certain that the manor's secrets would soon be laid bare. Chapter 10. The Spy's Gambit. The twilight over Worthington Manor was a delicate affair. With the sky bruised in shades of violet and the first stars piercing the dusk like pinpricks, the manor itself stood resolute, its Georgian silhouette softened by ivy, yet within its walls the air crackled with the unspoken weight of secrets poised to unravel. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting a soft cascade of pale blue wool in her lap, presented an image of serene domesticity, her spectacles glinting faintly in the lamplight. Yet her mind was a crucible of deduction, forging connections between the myriad clues that had emerged in the wake of Sir Henry Worthington's murder. The locked rooms, trick wire and wax manipulating the window latch had been exposed, and Clara Henshaw's tearful confession had illuminated Sir Henry's ruthless control over his household. Now Miss Marple's focus sharpened on Gretchen. Muller, the German maid whose Berlin ties and nocturnal activities suggested a role far beyond that of a servant. The past days had woven a complex tapestry. Lady Eleanor's cryptic letters hinting at external alliances. Captain Reginald Blake's midnight transaction at the well implicating him in a scheme involving Sir Henry's papers. Clara's coerced spying revealing a household bound by fear, and Gretchen's presence near the study with a wire, aligning her with the murder's mechanics. The cipher, Schlüssel, or key found near the well, coupled with the locked metal box retrieved from its depths, pointed to a conspiracy rooted in Sir Henry's Berlin scandal of 1905, when a leak of documents had nearly destroyed his career. Miss Marple sensed the truth was close, but it required a final, calculated move to draw the killer into the open. A spy, she murmured, her needles clicking rhythmically, thrives in shadows, but shadows shrank under scrutiny. The drawing room, with its heavy damask curtains and gilt-framed portraits, was quiet, save for the soft tick of a mantel clock and the occasional snap of the fire. The household was subdued, each member retreating into their own defences. Lady Eleanor in the library, sorting condolence letters with mechanical precision. Reginald in the billiard room, his cues clacking with restless force. Clara in her room, nursing her newfound fragility, and Gretchen moving through the house, her efficiency a mask for something far more calculated. Miss Marple had spent the morning with Inspector Katic, sharing Clara's confession and the implications of Gretchen's actions near the study. The metal box from the well remained unopened, its lock defying the locksmith's efforts, but the cipher 3792 had been tested on the study's safe, yielding nothing. Not the safe, Miss Marple had mused, but perhaps the box itself. Her plan was simple yet audacious, a trap to flush out the killer by leveraging the allure of Sir Henry's papers. She had suggested to Katic that they let slip a rumour within the household that the safe contained documents vital to national security, to be retrieved by the Foreign Office the following day. The bait was set, and Miss Marple's instincts told her that Gretchen, with her Berlin connections and proven skill with locks, would be unable to resist. People, she thought, act when they feel the noose tightening, and a spy is no exception. To plant the rumour, Miss Marple had engaged Hargreaves, the butler, in a carefully staged conversation in the morning room, loud enough to be overheard by the passing Gretchen. "It's quite extraordinary, Hargreaves," she had said, her tone one of innocent amazement. "Inspector Katic says, sir, Henry's safe holds papers so important that the Foreign Office is sending someone tomorrow to collect them. Secrets from his Berlin days. I gather matters of national security. One wonders what they could reveal." Hargreaves, unaware of the ruse, had nodded gravely, and Miss Marple had caught the flicker of Gretchen's shadow pausing in the hallway. Her dustcloth stilled. Now, as night deepened, Miss Marple prepared for the trap's culmination. She had arranged with Katic to keep watch near the study, hidden in the alcove by the servants' stairs, where the shadows offered cover. The study itself was left unguarded, its door locked, but its window a silent invitation to the killer's skill. Miss Marple, dressed in her darkest shawl and softest shoes, joined Katic in the alcove, her presence a quiet reassurance to the young inspector, whose nerves were taut with anticipation. "Are you sure about this, Miss Marple?" he whispered, his hand resting on his notebook. "It's a risk, letting her try for the safe." "Risk is the price of certainty," Miss Marple replied, her voice low but firm. "Gretchen is clever, but cleverness breeds confidence, and confidence breeds mistakes. We need only watch, Inspector, and the truth will show itself." She settled into the shadows, her eyes fixed on the study door, her heart steady despite the hour's gravity. The manor was silent, its occupants retired or feigning sleep, and the clock in the hall chimed 11. Minutes stretched into an eternity, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside and the distant bark of a fox. Then a soft sound of footstep, light but deliberate, owed from the corridor. Miss Marple's breath caught as a figure emerged. From the darkness, Gretchen, her fair hair tucked under a dark scarf, her movements as precise as a cat's. She carried a small, thin wire, glinting faintly in the moonlight that spilled through a window. She paused at the study door, glanced around, then moved to the window outside, her hands working with practiced ease. Miss Marple and Katic slipped silently to a vantage point near the study's exterior, crouching behind a rhododendron bush. Through the glass, they watched as Gretchen manipulated the window latch, her wire threading through a gap in the frame, a technique identical to the one used in the murder. The wax smear, Miss Marple noted, was no longer present, but the scratch on the frame was unmistakable, a silent witness to the killer's method. The latch clicked softly, and the window swung open. Gretchen climbed inside with the agility of a thief, her scarf slipping slightly to reveal her intense green eyes. Inside the study, she moved to the hidden panel behind the bookshelf, her fingers tracing its edges until it sprang open, revealing the safe. She knelt, her wire now a lockpick, and worked with a focus that bordered on obsession. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The safe, she whispered to Katic, but not the papers. The trap had been baited with a lither safe held. Only a decoy, a bundle of blank pages wrapped in an official seal, placed there by Katic that afternoon. Gretchen opened the safe, her movements swift, and withdrew the bundle. She unfolded it, her face registering first triumph, then confusion, then fury as she realized the papers were false. At that moment, Katic stepped forward, his torch blazing, and Miss Marple followed, her shawl slipping to her shoulders. "Miss Muller," Katic said, his voice firm, "that's enough. Step away from the safe and put down the wire." Gretchen froze, her eyes darting between Katic and Miss Marple, her composure cracking like thin ice. The wire fell from her hand, clattering to the floor, and she straightened, her scarf falling away to reveal a face pale but defiant. "I was only checking the window," she said, her accent thicker under pressure. "I heard a noise, thought it was a burglar." The excuse was flimsy, and her eyes betrayed her, searching for an escape that did not exist. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression one of quiet resolve. "A burglar, or a spy seeking papers that could ruin you." Her voice was gentle, but her words were steel, cutting through the maid's pretense. "You've been clever, my dear, but cleverness alone cannot hide the truth. You were in this study the night Sir Henry died, weren't you? With that wire and a pistol from his cabinet." Gretchen's lips parted, but no words came. Her hands clenched, and Miss Marple saw the moment when defiance gave way to resignation. "You can't prove it," she said, her voice low. "A wire, a safe, what does it mean? I'm a maid, nothing more." Katic moved to restrain her, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her eyes never leaving Gretchen's. "Not yet, Inspector," she said. "Let her speak. The truth is heavy, Gretchen, and you've carried it long enough. Sir Henry knew who you were, didn't he? A spy sent to retrieve the papers that named your network. When he threatened to expose you, you had no choice." Her tone was kind, almost maternal, but her words were a mirror, reflecting guilt. Gretchen's shoulders slumped, and her eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. He was going to tell, she whispered, her accent now unmistakably Berlin. He found my letters, my contacts. Schmidt warned me, but Sir Henry, he was relentless. I didn't want to kill him, but he left me no choice. The papers, they'd have destroyed everything. Her voice broke, and she sank to the floor, her scarf pulling around her like a fallen flag. Katic stepped forward, his handcuffs ready, but Miss Marple's gaze remained on Gretchen, her heart heavy with the tragedy of it all. You used the pistol from his cabinet, she said softly, and the wire to stage a locked room, hoping to deflect suspicion. But the wax, the scratch, they betrayed you, as small things often do. She turned to Katic, her voice steady. Take her, Inspector. The box in the well, the cipher'll confirm her story, I'm sure. As Katic led Gretchen away, her head bowed, Miss Marple lingered in the study, her eyes tracing the room's contours, the desk, the safe, the window. The trap had worked, but the victory was bittersweet. Gretchen was no mastermind, but a pawn in a larger game, driven by fear and loyalty to a cause that had used her ruthlessly. The papers, the scandal, the network, they were pieces of a puzzle that reached beyond the manor. But for now, the killer was caught, and justice would follow. The next morning, the household gathered in the dining room, its heavy curtains drawn, to let in the pale sunlight. Lady Eleanor was pale, her composure shaken by the night's events, but her eyes held a flicker of relief. Reginald was subdued, his restlessness replaced by a wary silence, perhaps aware that his own secrets were not yet safe. Clara was fragile, her hands steady, but her face etched with the strain of her confession. Miss Marple observed them all, her expression one of gentle sympathy, but her mind was already turning to the loose ends, the box, the cipher, the stranger at the well. At breakfast, Katic joined them, his notebook tucked away, but his expression triumphant. The box is open, he said, addressing Miss Marple, but loud enough for the others to hear. Letters, coded in German. They name Gretchen's contact Schmidt, among others. It's enough to build a case, and the Foreign Office is taking over from here. You were right, Miss Marple, about everything. His tone was one of awe, and Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. People, she said, are predictable, Inspector, when you know their hearts. Gretchen was desperate, but she wasn't alone. Keep an eye on the other's secrets, have a way of lingering. She sipped her tea, her needles clicking softly, and let the household absorb the news after breakfast. Miss Marple took a turn about the grounds, her shawl draped over her shoulders, ostensibly to admire the lavender, but, in truth, to reflect. Gretchen's capture had solved the murder, but the Berlin scandal, the papers, and Reginald's transaction suggested a deeper conspiracy, one that might never fully come to light. Lady Eleanor's letters, Clara's coercion, Reginald's desperation, they were distractions, but not without weight. A gambit, Miss Marple thought, requires sacrifice, and Gretchen was the pawn. Determined to tie up one final thread, Miss Marple visited the village telegraph office, where she received a reply from her London friend, Mr. Langley. His letter confirmed the Berlin scandal, a leak orchestrated by a German network, with Sir Henry as its unwitting dupe. The papers in his safe, Langley wrote, named operatives, including a young woman trained in espionage. Gretchen, Miss Marple murmured, or her predecessor. She tucked the letter away, her mind at ease, but her heart heavy with the cost of truth. Back at the manor, she engaged Lady Eleanor in conversation, probing gently about Sir Henry's methods. He was a complex man, Miss Marple said, her tone casual, as they sat in the morning room. So private, with his papers and his past. Did he ever speak of Berlin, or the troubles there? Lady Eleanor's hand paused on her teacup, but her reply was smooth. Henry rarely spoke of his work, she said. Berlin was a difficult time. He left it behind, or tried to. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, cool but guarded, and Miss Marple smiled, conceding the round but noting the evasion. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in the library. Her knitting resumed. The manor was quiet, but the silence was lighter, as if a storm had passed. Gretchen's confession had closed the case, but the echoes of Berlin lingered, a reminder that some secrets outlived their keepers. A spy's gambit, Miss Marple thought, is a game of trust, and trust, once broken, leaves scars. With that, she turned her thoughts to the final reckoning, certain that the manor's shadows would hold no more surprises. Chapter 11. The Unmasking. The late afternoon sun cast a mellow glow over Worthington Manor, its golden rays filtering through the tall elms and painting the Georgian facade with a warmth that belied the chill of secrets within. The house, with its ivy-clad walls and leaded windows, stood as a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded, its corridors now hushed in the aftermath of Gretchen Muller's capture. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting a soft cascade of pale blue wool in her lap, presented an image of serene composure, her spectacles glinting faintly in the fading light. Yet her mind was a crucible of clarity, weaving the final threads of Sir Henry Worthington's murder into a tapestry of truth. The locked room's trickwire and wax manipulating the window latch had been exposed, and Gretchen's confession, elicited by a carefully baited trap, had confirmed her as the killer. But the full picture, with its web of motives and deceptions, required one final reckoning. The drawing-room, with its heavy damask curtains and portraits of stern Worthington ancestors, was the chosen stage for the unmasking. Miss Marple had requested that Inspector Katic gathered the household, Lady Eleanor Worthington, Captain Reginald Blake, and Miss Clara Henshaw for what she described as a clarification of matters. The air was thick with anticipation, the fire in the grate crackling softly as the household assembled, each face a mask of guarded unease. Lady Eleanor sat erect, her black morning gown impeccable, her jet pin a stark contrast to her pale complexion. Reginald lounged in a chair, his military bearing undercut by a restless twitch in his fingers, while Clara perched on the edge of a settee, her hands clutching her handkerchief with a fragility born of her recent confession. Gretchen was absent, detained in the village lockup, but her presence lingered, a shadow cast across the room. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of quiet authority tempered by deference to Miss Marple. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice steady. "Miss Marple has some insights to share about Sir Henry's death. I think you'll find them illuminating." He nodded to her, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes sweeping the room with a gentle but unrelenting gaze. "My dear friends," she said, her voice soft but clear, "a murder in a house like this is like a stone dropped in a pond. The ripples touch everyone, revealing truths that might otherwise stay hidden. Sir Henry's death was no accident, nor was it a simple act of passion. It was a calculated act, rooted in secrets that stretch back to his days in Berlin. But to understand the killer, we must first understand the man and the household he shaped." Her tone was conversational, but her words were a net, drawing the listeners in. She turned to Lady Eleanor, her smile sympathetic but probing. "Lady Eleanor, you've borne this loss with remarkable strength. Sir Henry was a man of influence, but also of control. He kept secrets not just his own, but those of others. Your letters, for instance, from a gentleman in London. Sir Henry was curious about them, wasn't he? He enlisted Miss Henshaw to watch your correspondence, seeking leverage, perhaps, or proof of indiscretion." Lady Eleanor's face paled, her hand tightening on the arm of her chair. But she said nothing, her silence a wall Miss Marple knew better than to breach just yet. Turning to Clara, Miss Marple's expression softened. "Miss Henshaw, you've carried a heavy burden, a youthful mistake in Bath, a scandal that Sir Henry used to bind you to his will. You watched Lady Eleanor's letters, not out of malice, but fear. And on the night of the murder, you saw something Gretchen near the study with a wire in her hand. You didn't understand it then, but it frightened you, didn't it?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her handkerchief pressed to her lips, her confession now public but no less raw. Finally, Miss Marple's gaze settled on Reginald, whose restless fingers stilled under her scrutiny. "Captain Blake, you're a man of ambition, but also of debts. Sir Henry refused to fund your ventures, calling them reckless, and that stung. Your midnight meeting at the well, with a stranger who spoke of payment and documents, suggests you were entangled in something larger, perhaps selling Sir Henry's papers, or acting as a courier. The cipher Schlussel found near the well was a clue, but not to your guilt. You were a pawn, weren't you, in a game you didn't fully understand?" Reginald's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with defiance, but he remained silent, his silence as telling as any admission. Miss Marple leaned back, her hands folded in her lap. "Each of you had reason to resent Sir Henry," she said. "His control, his secrets, his refusal to bend. But resentment is not murder. The truth lies in the study, in a locked room that was never truly locked. The window, with its scratched frame and trace of wax, told the story. A wire, skillfully used, to secure the latch from outside, creating the illusion of an impossible crime. The pistol, taken from Sir Henry's cabinet, was returned to the floor, wiped clean but for a smudge, to deflect suspicion, and the safe, with its papers from Berlin, held the motive, a motive that drove one person to kill." She paused, letting the silence press against the room's occupants, then continued. "Gretchen Muller was no ordinary maid. She came to Worthington Manor 6 months ago, recommended by a Mr. Schmidt, a name tied to Sir Henry's Berlin days, when a leak of documents nearly ruined him. Those papers, locked in the safe, named operatives in a German intelligence network, including a young woman trained in espionage. Sir Henry, suspicious of Gretchen, confronted her, threatening to expose her to the Foreign Office. Faced with ruin, she acted. On the night of the murder, she used her wire to enter the study through the window, took the pistol from the cabinet, and during a cleaning task she'd been assigned, and shot Sir Henry. She staged the locked room, returned the pistol, and slipped out, leaving only the wax and the scratch to betray her." Lady Eleanor's hand rose to her throat, her composure cracking. "A spy," she whispered, "in our house. Henry never said." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the genuine shock in her eyes, mingled with something else, relief, perhaps, that her own secrets remained untouched. Clara's sobs broke the silence, her handkerchief sodden. "I saw her," she said, her voice trembling. "I should have spoken sooner, but I was afraid. She looked so determined with that wire. I thought she was stealing, not. She buried her face in her hands, and Miss Marple patted her shoulder gently, her touch a balm to the governess's guilt. Reginald shifted in his chair, his voice low but bitter. I didn't know, he said. The man at the well, he offered money for papers, said they were worth a fortune. I thought they were just old diplomatic notes, not this. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, I swear it. His eyes met hers, pleading, and she nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. You were tempted, Captain Blake, she said, but temptation is not murder. You sought to profit from Sir Henry's secrets, but Gretchen sought to protect her own. Her network, Schmidt, and others depended on those papers remaining hidden. When Sir Henry threatened to expose her, she had no choice but to silence him. She turned to Katic, her voice steady. The box from the well, Inspectorate's letters, confirm her connections, don't they? Katic nodded, his expression grim, coded messages, naming Schmidt and others. The Foreign Office is taking it from her espionage, is their domain, Gretchen's confessed, but she's not talking about her network. Says she acted alone, but I doubt it. He looked at Miss Marple, his respect palpable. You saw it all. Miss Marple, the wire, the wax, the motive. I'd have been chasing shadows without you. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that belied her frail appearance. Shadows are revealing, Inspector, when you know where to look. People betray themselves in the small things, a glance, a tool, a word. Gretchen was clever, but cleverness is no match for truth. She turned to the household, her tone gentle, but firm. This house has carried a heavy burden, secrets, fears, betrayals. But truth, like light, has a way of breaking through. Let it guide you now, as you heal. Lady Eleanor rose, her composure restored, but her eyes haunted. Thank you, Miss Marple, she said, her voice low. Henry was difficult, but he didn't deserve this. I'll see to the household, and the papers, they'll go to the proper authorities. Her words were resolute, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hand. A sign that her own secrets, those letters, might yet surface. Reginald stood, his shoulders slumped. I was a fool, he muttered. Thought I could outsmart him. Make my own way. I'll face whatever comes, debts, questions, all of it. His voice held a note of defiance, but Miss Marple saw the wariness beneath it. The weight of a man who had gambled and lost. Clara remained seated, her tears spent, her face pale but calm. I'm free, she whispered, almost to herself. He can't hold me any more. Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy with the governess's pain, but hopeful for her future. As the household dispersed, Katic lingered, his notebook in hand. What now, Miss Marple? He asked. The case is closed, but it feels unfinished. Those papers, the network, there's more to it, isn't there? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. There's always more, Inspector, she said. The Foreign Office will chase the shadows beyond this house, Schmidt, the network, the scandal. Our part is done, but theirs is just beginning. Keep your eyes open and your notebook ready. She smiled, her eyes twinkling, and Katic chuckled, shaking his head. You're a marvel, Miss Marple, he said. St. Mary Mead's lucky to have you. He took his leave, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The next morning, she took a final turn about the manor's grounds, her shawl draped over her shoulders, ostensibly to admire the lavender, but in truth to reflect. The case was solved, but the ripples remained. Lady Eleanor's letters, Reginald's debts, Clara's shame. Each had played a part. not in the murder, but in the web that had ensnared Gretchen. The Berlin scandal, with its leak and its operatives, was a shadow that stretched across decades, and Miss Marple knew that some truths would remain in the hands of Whitehall, where secrets were currency. At breakfast, the household was subdued. The absence of Gretchen a silent acknowledgment of the truth. Lady Eleanor spoke of the memorial service, her voice steady but her eyes distant. Reginald ate in silence, his restlessness replaced by a quiet resignation. Clara was fragile but composed, her hands steady for the first time in days. Miss Marple observed them all, her expression one of gentle sympathy, but her mind was already turning to her return to St. Mary Mead. Determined to tie up one final thread, she visited the village postmistress, Mrs. Cleary, to thank her for her help. Over tea in the cramped post office, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the Manor's correspondence. "Those letters with the bird crest," she said, her tone casual, "they must have been so intriguing. Did any come for Sir Henry after his death?" Mrs. Cleary's eyes gleamed, but she shook her head. "None since," she said, "though I heard from the telegraph boy there was one sent yesterday from the Manor to Berlin. No name, just an address. Odd, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her heart quickening. A final message, perhaps, from Gretchen's network, or a loose end yet to be tied. She thanked Mrs. Cleary and left, her mind at ease but her curiosity unsatisfied. Back at the Manor, she packed her valise, her knitting tucked carefully inside. The case was closed, but the echoes of Berlin lingered, a reminder that some games never truly ended. As she prepared to leave, she engaged Craddock one last time in the rose garden where the air was sweet with blooms. "Inspector," she said, "watch the post. A letter to Berlin may mean nothing or everything. Secrets have a way of lingering." "Like perfume," Craddock nodded, his notebook ready. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "Safe travels, Miss Marple. St. Mary Mead's waiting for you." She smiled, her eyes twinkling, and made her way to the station. Her shawl draped over her shoulders, as the train pulled away from St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed. The Manor's secrets had been unmasked, but the world beyond was full of shadows, and she knew that another puzzle would find her soon enough. People, she thought, hide their truths, but truth, like a rose, blooms in its own time. With that, she turned her thoughts to home, where her garden and her cat, Tigloth Pilzer, awaited her quiet wisdom. Chapter 12. The quiet returned the train from Worthington Manor, chugged steadily through the rolling hills of the English countryside, its whistle a mournful note against the backdrop of a June evening. The sky was a tapestry of soft pinks and golds, fading into twilight, and the fields beyond the window were dotted with grazing sheep and the occasional cluster of wildflowers. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the carriage window with her knitting bag at her side, gazed out at the passing landscape, her spectacles glinting faintly in the dim light. Her hands, usually busy with needles and pale blue wool, were still, resting in her lap as she reflected on the events that had unfolded at the Manor. The murder of Sir Henry Worthington had been solved, the killer unmasked, but the echoes of the case lingered, like the scent of roses after a summer rain. St. Mary Mead awaited her, its thatched cottages and winding lanes a haven of familiarity. After the grandeur and deceit of Worthington Manor, yet Miss Marple's mind was not yet at rest, turning over the intricate web of secrets that had bound the household. Lady Eleanor's guarded letters, Captain Reginald Blake's desperate schemes, Miss Clara Henshaw's coerced confessions, and Gretchen Muller's fatal espionage. The locked room, with its wire and wax trick, had been a clever illusion. But it was the human frailties, fear, ambition, shame that had driven the tragedy. People, she murmured, her voice lost in the rumble of the train, are so very predictable, yet so very surprising. The drawing room's unmasking had been a moment of quiet triumph, each suspect's role laid bare with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Gretchen, the German maid, had been revealed as a spy, driven to murder Sir Henry to protect her network's secrets. Papers from a 1905 Berlin scandal that named her operatives. The trap baited with a rumor of Foreign Office intervention had caught her in the act, her wire and lock-picking skills betraying her as the killer. Clara's tearful admission of blackmail, Reginald's reluctant confession of his illicit dealings, and Lady Eleanor's stoic silence had completed the picture. A household fractured by Sir Henry's ruthless control. Yet the resolution, though just, was bittersweet. A reminder that truth often came at the cost of broken lives. As the train neared St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the manor's aftermath. Lady Eleanor, poised but shaken, had promised to deliver the safe's papers to the Foreign Office. Her own secrets, those London letters, likely to remain buried, at least for now. Reginald, chastened by his brush with scandal, faced an uncertain future, his debts and ambitions a shadow he could not outrun. Clara, freed from Sir Henry's hold, had found a fragile peace, her confession a step toward redemption. And Gretchen, now in custody, was a pawn in a larger game, her network's tentacles reaching beyond the manor to Whitehall and Berlin. The metal box from the well, with its coded letters, had confirmed her guilt, but Miss Marple knew that some threads. Stranger at the well, the telegram to Berlin would be chased by others, in rooms she would never enter. The station at St. Mary Mead was a modest affair, its platform bathed in the glow of a single lantern. Miss Marple alighted, her valise in hand, and was greeted by the station master, Mr. Gibbs, whose ruddy face broke into a smile. "Back from your travels, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Village ain't been the same without you. Any grand adventures to tell?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her tone was mild. "Oh, just a quiet visit, Mr. Gibbs," she said, "though people, you know, are never quite as quiet as they seem." She thanked him and made her way along the lane to Danemead Cottage, her steps slow but steady, the familiar crunch of gravel underfoot a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. The cottage was as she had left it, its parlour neat and cosy, with the scent of lavender from the sachets she kept in the drawers. Her cat, Tigloth Pilzer, greeted her with a languid stretch and a demanding meow, weaving between her ankles as she lit the lamp and set her valise by the door. "You've managed without me, I see," she said, scratching his ears. "Though I dare say you've charmed the milkman into extra cream." She moved to the kitchen, putting the kettle on, and settled into her armchair by the fire, her knitting bag retrieved from the valise. As the kettle hummed, Miss Marple let her mind wander, the case's details unfolding like a well-worn book. The locked room had been a puzzle, but not an insoluble one-wire wax, and a steady hand had created the illusion of impossibility. Gretchen's motive, rooted in the Berlin scandal, was clear, but the household's complicity in witting, or otherwise, had deepened the tragedy. Sir Henry, with his diplomat's knack for secrets, had sown the seeds of his own destruction, using blackmail and suspicion to bind his household. Control, she thought, is a dangerous illusion, and it breeds rebellion. Her thoughts turned to Lady Eleanor. whose letters had hinted at a life beyond the manor lover, perhaps, or a confidant in London's elite circles. The crest on the envelopes, a lion rampant, suggested influence, but Miss Marple suspected. Eleanor's silence was her shield, a choice to protect her dignity rather than expose her heart. A woman, she mused, can bear much, but not exposure. She recalled Eleanor's tremor at the unmasking, a sign of relief that her secrets had not been the motive, but also of fear that they might yet surface. Reginald's role was more complex, his ambition a fire that had burned too brightly. The midnight meeting at the well, with its talk of payment and documents, had implicated him in a scheme to profit from Sir Henry's papers, but Miss Marple believed his ignorance of Gretchen's true purpose. He was a soldier, not a spy, driven by debts and dreams rather than ideology. Youth, she thought, is reckless, but it learns. She hoped Reginald would find a path forward, perhaps in the colonies, where his energy might be tempered. By purpose, Clara's confession had been the most poignant, a glimpse into a woman broken by shame and redeemed by truth. Her youthful indiscretion in Bath, exploited by Sir Henry, had trapped her in a cycle of fear, but her courage in speaking out had freed her. Miss Marple saw in Clara a resilience that would carry her forward, perhaps to a quieter post where her talents could flourish without coercion. Guilt, she thought, is a heavy chain, but it can be broken. Gretchen, the killer, was the enigma young woman trained in espionage, sent to retrieve papers that threatened her network. Her confession, raw and desperate, had revealed a pawn, not a queen, driven by loyalty and fear rather than malice. The Berlin scandal, with its leak and its operatives, was a shadow that stretched across decades. And Miss Marple knew that Gretchen's arrest was but a single thread in a larger tapestry, one woven in the secret rooms of intelligence agencies. A spy, she thought, is a soldier without a flag, and soldiers fall. The kettle whistled, and Miss Marple rose to make her tea, the ritual a grounding force after the manor's chaos. She returned to her armchair, Tigloff Pilzer curling at her feet, and resumed her knitting, the needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The village was quiet, its gossip likely to focus on her return, but Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead held its own secrets, small but no less human. The postmistress's mention of a telegram to Berlin, sent from the manor after Gretchen's arrest, lingered in her mind, a loose end, perhaps, but one for Katic and the Foreign Office to pursue. Her thoughts turned to Inspector Katic, whose diligence had been bolstered by her insights. He had called her a marvel, and she smiled at the memory, her modesty genuine but her pride quiet. The case had been a collaboration, her intuition guiding his procedure, and she trusted he would watch the manor's remaining threads. Eleanor's letters, Reginald's debts, the Berlin network. Youth, she thought, needs experience, and experience needs youth. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple reflected on the broader lessons of the case. Worthington Manor was a microcosm of human nature, its grandeur a facade for frailties, fear, loyalty, betrayal. Sir Henry's murder was not an isolated act, but a culmination of choices, each suspect shaped by their past and their desires. We are all, she thought, the sum of our secrets, and they shape us more than we know. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, a theft, not a murder, but driven by the same human currents. A young man, desperate for money, had stolen from his employer, only to be undone by a careless word overheard at the Blue Boar Inn. The parallel was striking, and Miss Marple saw in it a universal truth. Secrets, like seeds, grew in the dark. but withered in the light. Truth, she thought, is patient but relentless. Her knitting progressed, a scarf taking shape under her deft fingers, and she considered the villagers' own dramas. The vicar's feud with the organist, the postmistress's rivalry with the grocer, the schoolteacher's unspoken love for the doctor. All were puzzles, smaller but no less intricate. St. Mary Mead was her laboratory, its people her subjects, and Miss Marple knew that another mystery would find her soon enough. Life, she thought, is a series of riddles, and we solve them one by one. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her tea grown cold. She rose, stretching her limbs, and moved to the window, where the village lay in darkness, its lights winking like stars. Tigloth Pilzer followed, his tail flicking, and she smiled, her heart light despite the weight of the case. "You're right, my dear," she said to the cat. "Tomorrow is for roses and cream, but tonight is for rest." As she prepared for bed, her thoughts returned to Worthington Manor one final time. The roses still bloomed, the bees still hummed, but the house was changed, its innocence tarnished by the truth. Lady Eleanor would rebuild, Reginald would seek redemption, Clara would heal, and Gretchen would face justice, but the scars would remain. Healing, Miss Marple thought, is a slow bloom, but it comes. She climbed the stairs, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and settled into her bedroom, its familiar comforts a balm to her soul. The case was closed, but the world was full of shadows, and Miss Marple knew that her quiet wisdom would be called upon again. She opened her window, letting in the cool night air, and gazed at the stars, their light a reminder of truths yet to be uncovered. People, she thought, are a mystery, and mysteries are my garden. With that, she closed the curtains, her heart at peace, and slipped into bed, Tigloth piles curling at her feet. The village slept, its secrets safe for now, and Miss Marple drifted into dreams, certain that the next puzzle, like a rose, would bloom in its own time.